Tom Harris stepped out of his car, inhaling deeply as the crisp mountain air filled his lungs. The parking lot at Glacier National Park's eastern entrance was nearly empty, just as he'd hoped. It was early September, and the summer crowds had thinned out, leaving the wilderness to more experienced adventurers like himself. He shouldered his heavy backpack, grimacing slightly as he adjusted the straps. At 45, Tom was no spring chicken, but he prided himself on staying in shape. This solo trip had been on his bucket list for years, and he'd trained hard for it, determined to prove to himself that he still had what it took to tackle the backcountry. He approached the ranger station. A young woman in a forest green uniform stepped out to greet him. Her name tag read, Emily. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Glacier National Park. Are you headed out on the trails today?" Her cheerful demeanor matched the brightness of the morning sun. Tom nodded, pulling out his permit. "Yeah, I'm planning a 5-day trek through the backcountry. Got my permit right here." Emily glanced over the paperwork, her expression growing slightly more serious. "All right, Mr. Harris. I see you're an experienced hiker, but I still need to give you our standard safety briefing, especially regarding bear activity in the area. We've had a few sightings recently." Tom listened patiently as Emily went through the usual precautions: carry bear spray, make noise on the trail, properly store food, and what to do in case of an encounter. He'd heard it all before, but he appreciated the park's dedication to visitor safety. "Remember," Emily emphasized, "if you encounter a bear, do not run. Stand your ground, speak calmly, and slowly back away. If it charges, that's when you use your bear spray. Do you have some with you?" Tom patted the holster on his hip. "Right here. Never leave home without it." Emily nodded approvingly. "Good, man. Now you're headed up to the Pitamakan Pass area, correct? It's beautiful up there, but the weather can change quickly. Make sure you're prepared for anything." "Don't worry, I've got all the gear I need," Tom assured her, patting his backpack. "Been planning this trip for months." "All right then," Emily said, handing back his permit. "Remember to check in when you return. Have a safe trek, Mr. Harris." With a wave, Tom set off down the trail, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The morning was perfect. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the promise of adventure ahead. As he hiked, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. For the first few hours, Tom made good time, stopping only briefly to consult his map and GPS. The trail wound through dense forests, of pine and fir, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning vistas of snow-capped peaks and glacier-carved valleys. As the day wore on, however, Tom began to feel uneasy. The trail markers seemed to be getting farther apart, and the path itself was becoming less distinct. He checked his GPS again, frowning as he realized he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. "Damn it," he muttered to himself, squinting at the device. The screen showed his location, but the topography didn't quite match what he was seeing around him. He looked up at the sky, noticing with a start that the sun was much lower than he'd realized. Dusk was approaching fast. Tom's heart rate picked up as he tried to retrace his steps. The forest seemed to close in around him, shadows lengthening and deepening. He picked up his pace, ignoring the growing ache in his legs. "Stay calm," he told himself firmly. "You've been in tougher spots than this." But as the light continued to fade and the trail remained elusive, panic began to set in. Tom's breath came in short gasps as he pushed through the underbrush, searching for any sign of the main path. Suddenly, his foot caught on a hidden root, sending him sprawling face first onto the forest floor. Tom lay there for a moment, the taste of dirt and leaves in his mouth, feeling a wave of despair wash over him. "Get up," he growled, pushing himself to his knees. "You can't stay here." As he stood, brushing off his clothes, a sound froze him in place. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the gathering darkness to his left. Tom's blood ran cold. He slowly turned his head, straining his eyes to see through the gloom. There, just barely visible between two massive pines, he caught a glimpse of movement, something large and unmistakably alive. His hand instinctively went to the bear spray on his hip, but he didn't draw it yet. "Hey there," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just passing through, no need for trouble." The only response was another growl, deeper this time. Tom began to back away slowly, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it must be audible. He remembered Emily's words, "Don't run, stand your ground, back away slowly." But as he took another step back, his heel caught on a fallen log. Tom stumbled, arms windmilling as he fought to keep his balance. In that moment of distraction, he heard a thunderous crash of underbrush. Tom's head snapped up just in time to see a massive shape hurtling towards him. In the fading light, he caught a glimpse of gleaming teeth and powerful fur-covered muscles. "Oh God," he gasped, fumbling for his bear spray. But it was too late. The grizzly was upon him, its roar drowning out Tom's terrified scream as they both went crashing to the ground. In that moment, as the bear's hot breath washed over his face, Tom Harris realized with crystal clarity that all his experience, all his preparation, meant nothing in the face of nature's raw power. He was no longer a seasoned hiker or an adventurer. He was prey, pure and simple, at the mercy of one of nature's most fearsome predators. As the bear's massive paw swiped at him, claws glinting in the last light of day, Tom closed his eyes and prayed for a miracle. The wilderness he had come to. Challenge had answered in kind, and now his very survival hung in the balance. The sound of ripping fabric filled the air as the bear's claws tore through Tom's jacket. He felt a searing pain across his chest, but adrenaline dulled it to a distant concern. With a strength born of desperation, Tom brought his knee up hard, catching the bear in its belly. The grizzly reared back with a roar of surprise and pain, giving Tom a precious moment to scramble away. He pulled the bear spray from its holster, fumbling with the safety as he backed away. Come on," he muttered, fingers slick with sweat and blood. The bear shook its massive head, eyes locked on Tom with predatory focus. It dropped to all fours, muscles bunching as it prepared to charge again. Just as the bear lunged forward, Tom finally got the spray to work. He depressed the trigger, sending a cloud of capsaicin-laced mist directly into the animal's face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The grizzly reared up again, this time in obvious distress. It pawed at its face, snorting and shaking its head violently. Tom didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. Branches whipped at his face and arms as he fled, but Tom barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the pounding of his heart and the burning in his lungs. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing at the base of a large tree. For several long minutes Tom lay there, gasping for air, straining his ears for any sign of pursuit. But the forest had gone eerily quiet, save for the sound of his own ragged breathing. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain hit him in waves. His chest burned where the bear's claws had caught him, and he could feel warm blood soaking through what remained of his shirt. Various other cuts and bruises made themselves known, souvenirs of his panicked flight through the woods. Tom forced himself to sit up, leaning against the tree trunk for support. He fumbled in his pack for his first aid kit, hands shaking as he tried to assess the damage. The claw marks across his chest were deep, but not life-threatening, at least not immediately. He cleaned the wounds as best he could and applied pressure bandages, gritting his teeth against the pain. As he worked, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was lost in the wilderness, injured, and night was falling fast. His GPS was gone, probably lost in the scuffle with the bear. He had some supplies in his pack, but no shelter. His tent was in a stuff sack that had been attached to the outside of his backpack, now likely scattered somewhere in the woods behind him. "Think, Tom," he muttered to himself. "You've got to think." But exhaustion and shock were taking their toll. Tom's thoughts felt sluggish, his body heavy. He knew he should try to find a safer spot, maybe attempt to build some kind of shelter, but he couldn't summon the energy to move. As darkness settled over the forest like a shroud, Tom Harris huddled at the base of the tree, every snapping twig and rustling leaf sending a jolt of fear through him. The night stretched out before him, long and terrifying, filled with unseen dangers. He thought of Emily at the ranger station, of the safety briefing he'd listened to with such casual confidence. He thought of his family back home, who had no idea of the peril he now faced, and he thought of the bear out there somewhere in the darkness, a reminder of nature's brutal indifference to human ambitions. As he drifted in and out of a fitful doze, one thought kept circling in Tom's mind. If he survived this night, nothing would ever be the same again. The wilderness he had come to conquer had instead conquered him, stripping away his illusions of control and mastery. Whether he lived or died, Tom Harris had been forever changed by his encounter on the trail. And so he waited, alone in the vast, uncaring wilderness, for whatever dawn might bring. The night passed in a haze of pain and fear for Tom Harris. Every sound in the darkness sent his heart racing, convinced the bear was returning to finish what it had started. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Tom stirred from his fitful doze, his body stiff and aching. He groaned as he tried to move, the events of the previous day flooding back. The claw marks across his chest throbbed, a constant reminder of how close he'd come to death. Tom gingerly peeled back the makeshift bandages, wincing at the angry red lines that stood out against his pale skin. "God, what a mess," he muttered, fumbling in his pack for the first aid kit. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with his limited supplies, knowing infection was now a very real concern. As Tom repacked his bag, he took stock of his situation. He was lost, injured, and alone in one of the most remote areas of Glacier National Park. His GPS was gone, along with most of his gear. He had some food, water, and basic supplies, but without shelter or a way to navigate, his chances of survival were slim. "Okay, Tom," he said aloud, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "You've got to get moving. Find water. Try to get your bearings." He struggled to his feet, using the tree for support. Every movement sent waves of pain through his body, but Tom gritted his teeth and forced himself to take a step, then another. He picked a direction that seemed to slope downhill, reasoning that it might lead to a stream or river. As he walked, Tom tried to make noise, remembering the ranger's advice about avoiding surprise encounters with wildlife. He picked up a sturdy branch to use as a walking stick, tapping it against trees as he passed. "Hey, bear," he called out periodically, "just passing through." The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, small animals rustling in the underbrush. Under different circumstances, Tom might have found it beautiful. Now every noise set him on edge, his eyes darting around for any sign of danger. After what felt like hours of slow, painful progress, Tom's ears picked up the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through him as he quickened his pace, ignoring the protests of his battered body. He broke through a line of trees and found himself on the bank of a small, swift-moving stream. Tom dropped to his knees, cupping his hands to bring the icy water to his parched lips. It was only as he finished drinking that he noticed the large paw prints in the mud by the water's edge. Tom froze, his eyes scanning the area. The prints were fresh. The bear had been here recently. His hand went to the bear spray on his hip, relieved to find it still there. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. "You're okay, it's not here now." But even as he said it, a twig snapped in the forest behind him. Tom whirled around, heart pounding, to see a massive grizzly bear emerging from the trees. Time seemed to slow down. Tom's mind raced through everything he knew about bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Speak calmly. But as the bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over him, all that knowledge fled in the face of primal terror. "Nice bear," Tom said, his voice shaking. "Easy now, I don't want any trouble." The grizzly dropped back to all fours, its nose twitching as it caught Tom's scent. It took a step forward, then another. Tom backed up slowly, painfully aware of the rushing stream behind him. "Please," he whispered, though whether he was addressing the bear or some higher power he wasn't sure. "Please, just go away." For a moment it seemed like his plea might be answered. The bear paused, tilting its head as if considering Tom. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it charged. Tom's hand flew to his bear spray, but in his panic he fumbled the canister. It fell to the ground, rolling away towards the water. With no other option, Tom turned and plunged into the stream. The icy water hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, immediately, sweeping him off his feet. Tom flailed, trying to keep his head above water as he was pulled downstream. Behind him, he heard the bear's frustrated roar, but he couldn't spare a thought for it now. All his focus was on survival. As he was tossed through rapids, bouncing off rocks and submerged logs, just as Tom thought he couldn't hold on any longer, the stream widened and the current slowed. With the last of his strength, he managed to grab onto a low-hanging branch and pull himself towards the shore. Tom dragged himself onto the bank, coughing and gasping. He lay there for several minutes, shivering violently, too exhausted to move. When he finally managed to lift his head, he found himself in a small clearing he didn't recognize. "Great," he croaked. "Now I'm even more lost." As the adrenaline wore off, the pain returned with a vengeance. The icy plunge had aggravated his injuries, and new cuts and bruises made themselves known. Tom struggled to sit up, assessing the damage. His pack was gone, lost somewhere in the rushing water. With it went most of his supplies. Food, water, first aid kit, all swept away. Tom patted his pockets, finding only his waterlogged cell phone, still with no signal, and a soggy pack of matches. "Think, Harris," he muttered. "What's the first priority?" Shelter, he decided. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, but Tom knew how quickly the weather could change in the mountains. He needed to find or create some kind of protection before nightfall. Tom forced himself to his feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He stumbled towards the tree line, searching for anything he could use to build a makeshift shelter. As he gathered fallen branches and pine boughs, Tom found his thoughts drifting to his family. His wife Sarah would be expecting a check-in call soon. When she didn't hear from him, would she raise the alarm? How long before a search party was sent out? "They'll find me," Tom said aloud, needing to hear the words. "I just have to hang on until then." But as the day wore on and Tom struggled to construct a crude lean-to, doubt began to creep in. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. How would anyone know where to look for him? As dusk approached, Tom huddled in his shelter, shivering despite the warm day. His wounds were beginning to show signs of infection, the skin hot and swollen to the touch. He was dehydrated, hungry, and utterly exhausted. In the gathering darkness, strange sounds echoed through the forest. Tom tensed at every noise, imagining the bear around every tree. He knew rationally that he was probably safe for the moment. But rationality was in short supply after the events of the past 2 days. "Hello," he called out weakly. "Is anyone out there?" Only the wind in the trees answered him. Tom leaned back against the rough bark of a pine, closing his eyes. He tried to summon the energy to go search for water or food, but his body refused to cooperate. As night fell fully, Tom drifted in and out of consciousness. In his feverish state, he imagined he heard voices calling his name, saw flashlight beams cutting through the trees, but each time he opened his eyes, he found only darkness. "And silence, Sarah," he whispered, thinking of his wife's face. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The night stretched on, endless and terrifying. Every snapping twig became the bear's approaching footsteps in Tom's mind. He clutched a sharp stone he'd found, knowing it would be useless against a grizzly, but needing anything to feel less helpless. As the first light of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Tom made a decision. He couldn't stay here waiting to be found. He had to try to save himself. With monumental effort, Tom crawled out of his shelter. His body screamed in protest as he forced himself to stand, using a tree for support. He picked a direction at random. At this point, any direction was as good as another, and started walking. Each step was agony, but Tom pressed on. He had no food, no water, and no idea where he was, but he had the most basic human instinct of all, the will to survive. He stumbled through the forest. Tom Harris clung to a single thought. He would not die here. He would not become another statistic, another cautionary tale told by park rangers. He would live if only to see his family again, to tell them how much he loved them. And so he walked, one painful step at a time, deeper into the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park. Behind him, unbeknownst to Tom, a massive grizzly bear emerged from the trees, sniffing the air. It paused as if considering, then turned and lumbered off in the opposite direction. The forest watched, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath its canopy. In the grand scheme of nature, Tom Harris was just another creature fighting for survival in a world that cared nothing for his hopes or fears. His fate hung in the balance, to be decided by chance, skill, and the unforgiving laws of the wild. The rising sun cast long shadows through the trees as Tom Harris stumbled onward, each step a monumental effort. His injuries throbbed relentlessly, and the fever that had set in overnight left him disoriented and weak. Still, he pressed on, driven by a primal instinct to survive. One foot in front of the other, Tom muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from dehydration. Just keep moving. He had no idea how long he'd been walking or in which direction. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, a green maze with no exit in sight. Tom's thoughts drifted, memories and hallucinations blending together in his fevered mind. A flash of movement caught his eye, and Tom's heart leapt into his throat. But it was only a deer bounding away through the underbrush. He let out a shaky breath, trying to calm his frayed nerves. "Get it together, Harris," he chided himself. "You can't jump at every shadow." As the morning wore on, Tom's strength began to wane. His steps became more unsteady, his vision blurring at the edges. He knew he needed to find water soon, or his journey would come to a swift and tragic end. Just as despair began to set in, Tom heard a sound that made his heart soar, the faint trickle of running water. With renewed energy, he pushed through a dense thicket of bushes, emerging onto the bank of a small stream. Tom fell to his knees, cupping his hands to bring the cool, clear water to his parched lips. He drank deeply, ignoring the voice in the back of his mind warning about potential contaminants. At this point, dehydration was a far more immediate threat than giardia. As he sat back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, Tom's gaze fell on something that made his blood run cold. There, not 10 feet away, was the partially eaten carcass of an elk. "Oh God," Tom whispered, scrambling to his feet despite the protest of his aching body. He knew what this meant. He was in bear country, and this kill was fresh. The grizzly couldn't be far away. Tom's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. His hand went to his hip, only to remember with a sinking feeling that he'd lost his bear spray in the river. A low growl froze Tom in place. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound. There, emerging from the tree line, was the largest grizzly bear Tom had ever seen. Its fur was a rich brown, tinged with silver, and its muscles rippled with power beneath its massive frame. But what captured Tom's attention were its eyes, dark, intelligent, and fixed directly on him. Time seemed to stand still. Tom's mind raced through everything he knew about bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big, speak calmly. But as the bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over him, all that knowledge fled in the face of primal terror. Hey there," Tom stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just passing through, no need for trouble." The bear dropped back to all fours, its nose twitching as it caught Tom's scent. It took a step forward, then another. Tom backed, up slowly, painfully aware of the rushing stream behind him. "Nice bear," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Easy now. I don't want to hurt you, and I'm sure you don't want to hurt me." For a moment it seemed like his words might have an effect. The bear paused, tilting its head as if considering Tom. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it charged. Tom's survival instincts kicked in. With no weapon and nowhere to run, he did the only thing he could think of. He dove to the side, rolling away from the bear's initial rush. The grizzly's momentum carried it past Tom, but it wheeled around with surprising agility. Tom scrambled to his feet, adrenaline momentarily overriding the pain of his injuries. "Help!" he shouted, knowing it was futile but unable to stop himself. "Somebody help me!" The bear charged again. This time Tom wasn't quick enough. A massive paw caught him across the back, sending him sprawling to the ground. He felt a searing pain as claws raked across his skin, tearing through his already tattered shirt. Tom rolled onto his back, facing the bear as it loomed over him. In that moment he was certain he was going to die. He thought of Sarah, of the life they'd built together, of all the things he'd never get to say to her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, closing his eyes as the bear reared up for what he was sure would be the killing blow. But the blow never came. Instead, a deafening bang echoed through the clearing, followed by another. Tom's eyes flew open to see the bear stumbling backward, roaring in pain and confusion. "Hey! Over here, you overgrown fur coat!" Tom turned his head to see a figure emerge from the tree line. It was a woman, her grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, holding what looked like a large revolver. She fired again, the shot going wide but succeeding in driving the bear further back. "Can you move?" the woman shouted, not taking her eyes off the grizzly. Tom nodded, then realized she couldn't see him. Yee! Yes, he called back, his voice shaky. Then, get your ass over here now. Tom didn't need to be told twice. Ignoring the screaming pain in his back, he scrambled to his feet and ran towards his rescuer. The bear, confused and hurting from the gunshots, let out one final roar before turning and crashing off into the underbrush. As Tom reached the woman, his adrenaline began to fade, and the full extent of his injuries made themselves known. He stumbled, nearly collapsing at her feet. "Whoa there, city boy," the woman said, holstering her weapon and catching Tom before he fell. "Let's get you somewhere safe before Yogi changes his mind and comes back for round 2. Tom tried to respond, but the world was starting to spin. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the woman's voice, gruff but tinged with concern. "Hang in there, kid. You're going to be okay." When Tom regained consciousness, he found himself lying on a cot in what appeared to be a small cabin. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking filled the air. He groaned as he tried to sit up, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. Well, look who decided to join the land of the living. Tom turned his head to see the woman who had saved him sitting in a chair nearby, whittling a piece of wood. Up close, he could see the lines etched into her weathered face, speaking of a life lived outdoors. Where am I?" Tom croaked, his throat dry. The woman set aside her whittling and poured a glass of water from a nearby pitcher. "My humble abode," she said, handing him the glass. "Name's Margaret, but most folks around here call me Maggie. You're about 15 miles off the main trail, in case you were wondering." Tom drank the water gratefully, then asked, "How long was I out?" "About a day and a half," Maggie replied. "You were in pretty rough shape when I found you. Bears'll do that to a person." The memory of the attack came flooding back, and Tom shuddered. "Thank you," he said fervently. "You saved my life." Maggie waved off his thanks. "Don't mention it. Couldn't very well leave you out there to be bear chow, could I? Now, you feel up to eating something? You look like you could use a good meal, as—" If on cue, Tom's stomach growled loudly. Maggie chuckled and went to the small stove in the corner of the cabin, returning with a bowl of what smelled like venison stew. As Tom ate, Maggie filled him in on what had happened. She was a retired park ranger who now lived off the grid, keeping an eye on this remote section of the park. She'd heard Tom's shouts and arrived just in time to drive off the bear. "You're lucky to be alive," she said bluntly. "What were you doing out there alone anyway?" Tom explained about his solo hiking trip gone wrong, how he'd gotten lost and then attacked by the bear. Maggie listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious as he recounted his ordeal. When he finished, she shook her head. "You made some rookie mistakes, son, but you're not the first, and you won't be the last. The wilderness doesn't care how experienced you think you are." "I know that now," Tom said quietly, looking down at his hands. "I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong." Maggie's expression softened slightly. "Well, you're alive. That's something. And maybe you've learned a lesson that'll keep you that way in the future." She stood up, stretching. "You should get some more rest. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, we'll see about getting you back to civilization." As Maggie turned to leave, Tom called out, "Wait, the bear. Will it be okay? I mean, you shot it." Maggie paused at the door, a hint of a smile on her face. "Rubber bullets," she said. "Hurt like hell, but won't do any lasting damage. That bear's probably nursing a headache and a bruised ego, but it'll live to scare the pants off another hiker someday." With that, she left, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. As he lay back on the cot, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the cabin's ceiling, Tom Harris realized how close he'd come to death. The wilderness he'd come to challenge had nearly claimed him, and only chance and the kindness of a stranger had saved him. He thought of Sarah, of the worry she must be feeling. He thought of the search parties that were probably combing the park for him right now, and he thought of the bear, out there in the vastness of Glacier National Park, a reminder of nature's power and indifference. Tom closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. For the first time in days, he felt safe, but he knew that this experience had changed him forever. The wilderness had shown him its true face, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and Tom Harris would never look at it the same way again. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's small windows as Tom Harris slowly came to consciousness. For a moment, he was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a spike of panic before memory rushed back. The bear attack, his rescue by Maggie, the safety of the cabin, it all came flooding in, bringing with it a mix of relief and lingering fear. He gingerly sat up, wincing at the pain that radiated from his various injuries. The claw marks on his back felt like they were on fire, and every muscle in his body ached from his ordeal in the wilderness. But he was alive, and for that, Tom was profoundly grateful. "Well, look who's up and at 'em," Maggie's gruff voice came from the doorway. She entered carrying a steaming mug that she handed to Tom. "Drink this. It'll help with the pain." Tom took the mug, inhaling the pungent aroma of what seemed to be some kind of herbal tea. "Thanks," he said, his voice still hoarse. He took a sip, the bitter liquid warming him from the inside. "What's the plan for today?" Maggie sat down in her chair, fixing Tom with a critical eye. "That depends on you, city boy. How are you feeling? Think you can make the trek back to civilization?" Tom considered for a moment. Every part of him hurt, but the thought of getting back, of seeing Sarah and ending this nightmare, was powerful motivation. "I can do it," he said with more confidence than he felt. Maggie nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. "All right then, we'll head out in an hour. It's about a day's hike to the nearest ranger station. Think you can handle that?" "I have to," Tom replied simply. As they prepared for the journey, Maggie outfitted Tom with some spare clothes and a backpack filled with supplies. She showed him how to properly apply moleskin to prevent blisters and gave him a crash course in using a compass and topographic map. "No more relying on fancy GPS gadgets," she said sternly. "Out here, you need to know the basics." Tom listened intently, soaking up every bit of knowledge. He was determined not to make the same mistakes again. As they set out from the cabin, the forest seemed different to Tom. What had once felt like an exciting playground now loomed as a potential death trap. Every rustle in the bushes made him jump, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. Maggie noticed his tension. "Relax, kid," she said as they hiked. "Being alert is good, but if you're wound this tight, you'll miss important things. The forest isn't your enemy. Respect it, and it'll usually leave you alone." Tom tried to take her advice, forcing himself to breathe deeply and take in their surroundings. Gradually, he began to notice things he'd overlooked before. The different bird calls, the subtle signs of animal trails, the way the terrain changed as they moved. As they walked, Maggie shared stories of her years as a park ranger. She told of daring rescues, close encounters with wildlife, and the profound beauty she'd witnessed. Tom found himself hanging on every word, seeing the wilderness through new eyes. "Why'd you leave?" he asked during a brief rest. "Seems like you loved the job." Maggie's face grew somber. "Loved it too much, maybe. Spent so much time out here that I forgot how to be around people. One day I realized I felt more at home in the backcountry than I did in town. So I decided to make it official." They continued on, the journey grueling but manageable, thanks to Maggie's expert guidance. As the day wore on, however, the weather began to turn. Dark clouds rolled in and a chill wind picked up. "Storm's coming," Maggie said, eyeing the sky. "We need to pick up the pace." They quickened their steps, but the storm moved faster. Soon, rain began to fall, first a light drizzle, then a steady downpour. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Tom found himself shivering despite the exertion. "We can't make it to the station before dark," Maggie shouted over the wind. "We need to find shelter and wait it out." They veered off their path, Maggie leading them to a rocky outcropping that provided some protection from the elements. As they huddled under the overhang, Tom felt a familiar sense of dread creeping in. "What if it doesn't let up?" he asked, teeth chattering. "What if—" "Stop," Maggie cut him off firmly. "No use worrying about what-ifs. We deal with what is. Right now that means getting dry and staying warm." She efficiently set up a small tarp for additional shelter and got a fire going despite the wet conditions. As they sat close to the flames, sharing a meager meal of trail mix and beef jerky, Tom found himself marveling at Maggie's calm competence. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you stay so unafraid?" Maggie was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Tom had yet heard it. "I am afraid, kid. Anyone with sense is afraid out here. The trick is not letting it paralyze you. Fear can keep you alive if you use it right. It's when you let it take over that you get into trouble. As night fell and the storm raged on, Tom found himself reflecting on his journey. He thought of his overconfidence at the start, his terror during the bear attack, and now this newfound respect for the wilderness and those who truly understood it. "I've been an idiot," he said suddenly. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "This whole trip," Tom continued, "I thought I could just walk into the backcountry and, I don't know, conquer it or something, like it was some kind of game. But it's not, is it? It's real and it's dangerous, and I was nowhere near prepared." "Now you're getting it," Maggie nodded. "The wilderness doesn't care about your ego or your midlife crisis or whatever brought you out here. It just is. Beautiful and brutal all at once." They lapsed into silence, the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind the only sounds. Tom found himself dozing off, exhaustion overtaking him despite the discomfort. He was jolted awake some time later by a sound that made his blood run cold, a low rumbling growl that cut through the noise of the storm. Tom's eyes flew open, darting around in panic. Maggie was already on her feet, her hand on her holstered pistol. "Easy," she whispered. "Don't move." Through the curtain of rain, Tom could make out a massive shape moving at the edge of the firelight. His heart pounded so hard he was sure it would burst from his chest. The bear, and Tom was certain it was the same one that had attacked him before, lumbered into view. It stood on its hind legs, water streaming off its fur, looking like some primordial force of nature. Time seemed to stand still. Tom held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed for flight. But Maggie remained calm, her eyes locked on the bear. To Tom's amazement, she began to speak, her voice low and soothing. "Hey there, big guy. No need for trouble, we're just passing through, same as you." The bear dropped back to all fours, its head swinging between Maggie and Tom. It took a step forward, then another. "That's it," Maggie continued. "You just keep on moving. Plenty of space for all of us out here." For a heart-stopping moment, Tom was sure the bear would charge, but then, almost casually, it turned and ambled off into the rainy darkness. Tom let out a shaky breath, feeling lightheaded with relief. How did you do that?" Maggie sat back down, though her posture remained alert. "Wasn't me, kid. That bear made its own choice. We just got lucky it wasn't feeling confrontational." As the adrenaline wore off, Tom found himself shaking, the close encounter bringing all his fear rushing back. But mixed with the fear was something else, a profound sense of awe. "It was beautiful," he said softly. "Terrifying, but beautiful." Maggie nodded, a small smile on her weathered face. "Now you're really getting it. That's the wilderness for you. It'll scare you half to death one minute and take your breath away the next." As the night wore on and the storm gradually began to subside, Tom felt something shifting inside him. The fear was still there, but it was tempered now by respect, even reverence. He thought of how he'd described this experience to Sarah, to his friends back home. He knew that no words could fully capture it, this feeling of being simultaneously insignificant and deeply connected to something vast and ancient. As dawn broke, painting the wet forest in shades of gold and green, Tom Harris looked out at the wilderness with new eyes. He was a changed man, humbled and enlightened by his brush with nature's raw power. Maggie stood, stretching out the kinks from their uncomfortable night. "Ready to get back to civilization, city boy?" Tom nodded, getting to his feet with only a small wince of pain. "Yeah," he said. "But you know what? I think I'll be coming back someday, properly prepared next time." Maggie clapped him on the shoulder, her approval evident. "Good man. The wilderness'll be waiting. It always is." With that, they set off, leaving the shelter of their temporary haven. As they hiked, Tom breathed in the crisp, rain-washed air, feeling more alive than he had in years. The journey wasn't over, but he was no longer the same man who had started it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with newfound wisdom and respect for the wild world around him. The sun had climbed high in the sky by the time Tom and Maggie emerged from the dense forest onto a well-maintained trail. Tom's heart leapt at the sight of it, a sign of civilization, of safety, after days of perilous wilderness. "There you have it, city boy," Maggie said, a hint of pride in her gruff voice. "Told you I'd get you back." Tom nodded, emotion welling. up in his throat. "I can't thank you enough, Maggie. I wouldn't have made it without you." Maggie waved off his gratitude. "Save it for when we get you to the ranger station. We've still got a few miles to go." As they walked, Tom found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. The bear encounter from the night before was still fresh in his mind. "Does it ever get easier?" he asked Maggie. "Being out here, I mean. Knowing what's out there." Maggie considered for a moment before answering. "It gets different. You learn to read the forest, to understand its rhythms. The fear doesn't go away, not really, but it becomes a tool, not a hindrance." They walked in silence for a while, Tom mulling over her words. The trail wound through stands of towering pines and across babbling streams. Under different circumstances, Tom might have found it idyllic. Now, he saw potential danger at every turn. As they rounded a bend, a new sound reached their ears. Voices. Tom's pace quickened involuntarily. "Easy," Maggie cautioned. "Let's not go stumbling into anything half-cocked." They approached cautiously, and soon the source of the voices became clear. A small group of hikers was gathered around a man in a park ranger uniform. As Tom and Maggie drew closer, they could make out what the ranger was saying. Last seen. 5 days ago. If you spot any sign of him or his gear, don't approach, just mark the location and report back immediately. We don't want to risk contaminating any potential evidence. Tom's breath caught in his throat. They were looking for him. "Looks like your welcoming committee's already here," Maggie murmured. Before Tom could respond, one of the hikers spotted them. "Hey, over here, we've found him." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The ranger rushed over, radioing for backup as he peppered Tom with questions. The hikers crowded around, eager to hear the story of the man who'd survived nearly a week alone in the wilderness. Through it all, Tom found himself looking for Maggie. She stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. "Sir, we need to get you checked out," the ranger was saying. "There's a medical team on the way. Can you tell me what happened? How did you survive out there?" Tom opened his mouth to explain, to tell them about Maggie and her crucial role in his survival. But when he turned to point her out, she was gone. "There was a woman," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "She saved me from a bear attack, took me to her cabin. Her name was Maggie. She said she used to be a ranger." The ranger's brow furrowed. "Sir, there's no record of any former rangers living in this area. Are you sure you didn't imagine?" "No," Tom interrupted, more forcefully than he'd intended. "She was real. She got me through the storm last night. He trailed off, doubt creeping in. Had he imagined her? Was she some kind of fever dream, a manifestation of his desperate need for help? The arrival of the medical team cut short any further discussion. Tom found himself being loaded onto a stretcher, an IV inserted into his arm as the paramedics fussed over his injuries. As they began to carry him down the trail, Tom craned his neck, searching the tree line for any sign of Maggie. But there was nothing, just the endless green of the forest. The next few hours passed in a haze of medical examinations, debriefings, and tearful phone calls with Sarah. Tom recounted his ordeal multiple times, each retelling making it feel more surreal. When he mentioned Maggie, he was met with skeptical looks and gentle suggestions that perhaps his mind had created a comforting presence to help him through his ordeal. But Tom knew what he had experienced was real. It wasn't until late that evening, as he lay in a hospital bed in the nearby town, that Tom had a moment to truly process everything that had happened. Sarah was on her way, driving through the night, to reach him. The doctors had assured him that despite his injuries and ordeal, he would make a full recovery. A soft knock at the door roused Tom from his thoughts. A park ranger, a different one from earlier, stepped into the room. "Mr. Harris, I'm Ranger Coleman. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to follow up on something you mentioned earlier." Tom sat up straighter, wincing slightly at the pull of his stitches. "Of course, what is it?" Ranger Coleman pulled up a chair. "You mentioned a woman named Maggie who helped you. Said she was a former ranger?" "That's right," Tom nodded eagerly. "Do you know her?" The ranger's face was carefully neutral. "Mr. Harris, what I'm about to tell you is not common knowledge. It's not something we typically share with the public." Tom leaned forward, his heart racing. About 15 years ago, there was a ranger named Margaret Hawkins. She was something of a legend in these parts, knew the backcountry better than anyone. One winter, she went out on a routine patrol and never came back. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" "We searched for weeks," Ranger Coleman continued. "Never found a body. But we did find her cabin, way off any marked trails. It was fully stocked, like she'd just stepped out for a moment." "That's where she took me," Tom whispered, "after the bear attack." The ranger nodded slowly. "Here's the thing, Mr. Harris. Over the years, we've had a handful of reports, lost hikers, people in desperate situations, who claim they were helped by a woman matching Maggie's description, always in that same area of the park." Tom's mind reeled. "Are you saying—" "What are you saying?" Ranger Coleman shrugged. "I'm not saying anything definitively. Maybe there's a recluse out there who matches Maggie's description. Maybe it's something we can't explain. All I know is, you're not the first to tell this story. And I doubt you'll be the last." As the ranger stood to leave, Tom found his voice again. "Wait, do you believe me?" Coleman paused at the door. "Mr. Harris, I've been working these woods for 20 years. One thing I've learned is that the wilderness has its own rules, its own mysteries. Sometimes the best we can do is be grateful for the help we receive, whatever form it takes." With that, he was gone, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. As night fell outside his window, Tom replayed every moment of his ordeal in his mind. The terror of the bear attack, the comfort of Maggie's cabin, the wisdom she'd imparted as they trekked through the forest. It had all been so visceral, so real. He thought of what Maggie had told him about fear, about respect for the wilderness. Whether she was flesh and blood or something more ephemeral, the lessons she'd taught him were undeniably real. Tom's gaze drifted to the window, where he could just make out the dark line of the forest against the night sky. Out there, beyond the reach of civilization, the wilderness waited. Beautiful and brutal, just as Maggie had said. As he drifted off to sleep, Tom made a silent promise. He would return to those woods someday, not to conquer them. He knew now how foolish that notion had been, but to honor them. To remember the lessons he'd learned and perhaps, just perhaps, to catch a glimpse of a gray-haired woman moving silently through the trees, watching over those who had lost their way. In his dreams that night, Tom heard Maggie's voice one last time. "The wilderness'll be waiting. It always is." And in that moment, despite everything he'd been through, Tom Harris felt a profound sense of peace. The soft beep of medical equipment and the muted bustle of hospital activity filtered through Tom's consciousness as he slowly awoke. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. The sterile white walls a stark contrast to the verdant forest he'd called home for the past week. Reality came crashing back as he shifted in the bed, his body protesting with a chorus. "Of aches and pains, Tom. Honey, are you awake?" Sarah's voice, filled with concern and relief, brought tears to Tom's eyes. He turned his head to see his wife sitting beside the bed, her face etched with worry and fatigue. "Sarah," he croaked, his throat still raw. "You're here." She leaned forward, grasping his hand tightly. "Of course I'm here. God, Tom, I thought I'd lost you." The emotion in her voice hit Tom like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own survival that he hadn't fully considered what Sarah must have been going through. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I never meant to put you through this." Sarah shook her head, wiping away a tear. "Don't apologize. You're alive. That's all that matters right now." A knock at the door interrupted their reunion. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand, followed by two men in ranger uniforms. "Mr. Harris," the doctor began, "how are you feeling this morning?" Tom took a moment to assess. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly bear," he replied, attempting a weak smile. The doctor nodded, not returning the humor. "Well, that's not far from the truth. You've got some nasty lacerations on your back and chest, various cuts and bruises, and you're dealing with the effects of exposure and dehydration. But considering what you've been through, you're in remarkably good shape." One of the rangers stepped forward. "Mr. Harris, I'm Ranger Michaels, and this is Ranger Peterson. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your experience if you're feeling up to it." Tom glanced at Sarah, who gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Sure," he said. "What do you want to know?" For the next hour, Tom recounted his ordeal in detail. Getting lost, the initial bear encounter, his desperate flight through the forest. When he got to the part about Maggie and her cabin, he noticed the rangers exchange a look. "This woman—" "Maggie," Ranger Peterson interjected. "Can you describe her again?" Tom furrowed his brow, recalling Ranger Coleman's late-night visit. Grey hair in a bun, weathered face, probably in her 60s or 70s. She said she was a former ranger. Ranger Michaels jotted something in his notebook. "And you're certain about the location of this cabin?" I think so," Tom replied, doubt creeping into his voice. Everything was so confusing, but I'm sure it was real. The rangers shared another glance. "Mr. Harris," Ranger Peterson said carefully, "we've done a thorough search of the area where we found you. There's no sign of any cabin, nor of anyone living in that region." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "But that's impossible. She saved me. She guided me back." Sarah leaned in, her face a mix of concern and confusion. "Tom, honey, when they found you, you were alone. There was no woman." Tom's mind reeled. Had it all been a hallucination? A dream conjured by his desperate mind? "No," he said firmly. "No, she was real. The tea she gave me, the stories she told, the bear, she faced down the bear." The doctor stepped in, his voice soothing. "Mr. Harris, it's not uncommon for individuals in extreme survival situations to experience vivid hallucinations. Your mind may have created this Maggie as a coping mechanism." Tom shook his head vehemently, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "You don't understand. She taught me things, showed me how to survive. How could I have made it out without her?" Ranger Michaels cleared his throat. "Actually, Mr. Harris, that's something we wanted to discuss. Your survival, well, it's quite remarkable. We'd like to talk about the possibility of using your experience in our wilderness safety programs." Tom barely heard him, his mind still grappling with the implications of Maggie's non-existence. Sarah, sensing his distress, intervened. "I think that's enough for now," she said firmly. "My husband needs to rest." The rangers nodded, gathering their things. As they turned to leave, Ranger Peterson paused. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice low. "For what it's worth, you're not the first person to mention a mysterious woman helping them in those woods. Make of that what you will." With that cryptic statement, they left, leaving Tom with more questions than answers. The next few days passed, in a blur of medical checks, visits from friends and family, and sessions with a trauma counselor. Tom found himself growing increasingly frustrated. Everyone seemed determined to explain away his experience, to rationalize it into something that fit neatly into their understanding of the world. But Tom knew what he had experienced. The feel of Maggie's rough hands as she tended his wounds, the smell of wood smoke in her cabin, the sound of her voice as she shared her wisdom. It had all been too vivid, too real to be a mere hallucination. On the day of his release from the hospital, Tom stood at the window of his room, gazing out at the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the national park. Sarah entered, carrying a small duffel bag of his clothes. "Ready to go home?" she asked gently. Tom didn't turn from the window. "It doesn't make sense, Sarah. How could I have survived out there on my own? The things I learned, the way I found, my way back, that all came from Maggie." Sarah came up beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "Tom, does it really matter? You're alive. You made it out. Maybe this Maggie, real or not, was exactly what you needed to survive." Tom considered her words. He thought of what Maggie, or his idea of Maggie, had taught him about the wilderness, about respect and fear, and the thin line between survival and disaster. "I need to go back," he said suddenly. Sarah stiffened beside him. "What?" "Tom, you can't be serious." He turned to face her, his eyes alight with a determination she hadn't seen since before his ordeal. "Not now, not right away, but someday. I need to understand what happened to me out there." Sarah studied his face for a long moment before sighing. "I don't like it, but I know that look. Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks." Tom pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of his still healing injuries. "I promise, and Sarah, thank you for understanding." As they left the hospital, Tom cast one last look at the distant forest. Whether Maggie was real or a product of his desperate mind, she had changed him. He had entered those woods an arrogant man, certain of his ability to conquer nature. He had emerged humbled, with a newfound respect for the wild and its power. In the months that followed, as Tom slowly recovered and readjusted to normal life, he often found his thoughts drifting back to those harrowing days in the wilderness. He pored over maps of the area, trying to pinpoint the location of Maggie's cabin. He reached out to other hikers and park employees, quietly asking if they'd ever encountered a gray-haired woman in the backcountry. Most dismissed his story, but a few, a very few, would get a faraway look in their eyes. They'd speak in hushed tones of impossible rescues, of wisdom imparted by a phantom ranger, of a presence in the woods that defied explanation. And late at night, when the house was quiet and sleep eluded him, Tom would stand at his window, looking out at the stars. He'd remember Maggie's words, "The wilderness will be waiting, it always is." In those moments, Tom Harris knew with unshakable certainty that his journey wasn't over. Someday, he would return to those woods, not to conquer them, but to honor them, to remember the lessons he'd learned, and perhaps, just perhaps, to catch a glimpse of a gray-haired woman moving silently through the trees, watching over those who had lost their way. Until then, he would carry the wilderness within him, its beauty, its danger, and its mysteries. For Tom had learned the most important lesson of all, that true respect for nature came not from trying to master it, but from recognizing one's own small place within its vast, indifferent grandeur. 6 months had passed since Tom Harris's harrowing ordeal in Glacier National Park. The physical scars had mostly healed, leaving only faint pink lines across his back and chest. The psychological scars, however, ran deeper. Tom stood at the edge of his backyard, staring into the small patch of woods behind his suburban home. It was a far cry from the vast wilderness he'd faced, but even this modest copse of trees now held a certain power over him. "Tom," Sarah's voice called from the house, "dinner's ready." He turned, catching sight of his wife framed in the doorway. The worried furrow of her brow had become all too familiar over the past months. "Coming," he replied, casting one last glance at the trees before heading inside. As they sat down to eat, Sarah studied her husband's face. "You were out there again," she said. It wasn't a question. Tom nodded, pushing his food around the plate. "I was just thinking about going back." Sarah's voice held a mix of concern and resignation. "I have to, Sarah," Tom said, meeting her eyes. "I need to understand what happened to me out there." Sarah set down her fork, her appetite gone. "Tom, we've been over this. The doctors, the rangers, they all said—" "I know what they said," Tom interrupted, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "But they weren't there. They didn't experience what I did." "And what exactly did you experience, Tom?" Sarah challenged. "A mysterious woman who no one else has seen? A cabin that doesn't exist? Or was it just your mind playing tricks on you while you were fighting for your life?" Tom pushed back from the table, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Sarah. That's why I need to go back. I need to find answers." Sarah's expression softened. "I'm just worried about you, Tom. You haven't been the same since you came back. The nightmares, the way you jump at every little sound, is going back really going to help, or is it just going to open old wounds?" Tom moved to kneel beside his wife's chair, taking her hands in his. "I know you're worried, but I can't move on until I face this. I need to go back to see it all with clear eyes." Sarah searched his face for a long moment before sighing. "I can't stop you, can I?" Tom shook his head. "I have to do this, but I promise I'll be careful. I've learned my lesson about underestimating the wilderness." 2 weeks later, Tom found himself back at the entrance to Glacier National Park. This time he wasn't alone. He'd hired Mark Redford, an experienced local guide, to accompany him. "You sure about this, Mr. Harris?" Mark asked as they shouldered their packs. "These woods can play tricks on a man's mind, especially one who's been through what you have." Tom nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I need to retrace my steps to understand what really happened out there." As they set off down the trail, Tom felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation coursing through him. Every sound, every smell brought back vivid memories of his ordeal. They hiked for hours, Tom doing his best to recognize landmarks from his previous journey. But everything looked different now, in the bright light of day, with a clear mind, and A full stomach. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Mark suggested they make camp. "We're getting into grizzly country," he warned. "Best not to push our luck after dark." They set up their tent and built a small fire. As they sat eating their freeze-dried meals, Tom found himself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a familiar figure emerge from the shadows. "You want to tell me what we're really looking for out here?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Tom hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy. "When I was lost, I met someone, a woman named Maggie. She saved me from a bear attack, took me to her cabin, taught me how to survive. But when I was rescued, they said there was no woman, no cabin, nothing." Mark's expression remained neutral. "And you think she's still out here somewhere?" "I don't know," Tom admitted. "Maybe she was real. Maybe she wasn't. But I need to know, for sure." Mark nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Harris, I've been guiding in these parts for 20 years, and I can tell you one thing for certain. These woods have their own rules. Sometimes things happen out here that defy explanation." As night fell, Tom found sleep elusive. He lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, so familiar and yet so alien. In the distance, he heard the low rumbling call of a grizzly bear. The next morning, they broke camp early and continued their trek. Tom led the way, following some internal compass that he couldn't quite explain. "We're off the main trail now," Mark warned as they pushed through dense underbrush. "You sure you know where we're going?" Tom paused, looking around. Something about this place felt familiar. I think this is where I first saw the bear, where Maggie saved me." As if on cue, a loud crash echoed through the trees. Tom and Mark froze, eyes wide. Emerging from the forest came an enormous grizzly bear, its fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. It rose up on its hind legs, easily towering over both men. "Don't move," Mark whispered, slowly reaching for his rifle. But Tom wasn't afraid. As he looked into the bear's eyes, he felt a strange sense of recognition. This was the same bear that had attacked him. He was sure of it. "Hello, old friend," Tom said softly. The bear dropped back to all fours, tilting its head as if considering Tom's words. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other. Then, with a snort and a shake of its massive head, the bear turned and lumbered back into the forest. Mark let out a shaky breath. "I've never seen anything like that." "How did you know it wouldn't? Attack?" Tom shook his head, bewildered. "I didn't, I just felt it." They continued on, the encounter with the bear leaving them both shaken and exhilarated. As they crested a small hill, Tom suddenly stopped short. "There," he said, pointing, to a small clearing. "That's where the cabin should be." But the clearing was empty, showing no signs of human habitation. Tom's heart sank as he walked to the center of the space, turning in a slow circle. "I don't understand," he muttered. "It was right here. I remember it so clearly." Mark approached, cautiously. "Mr. Harris, sometimes our minds can—" "No," Tom interrupted. "It was real. I know it was real." As the words left his mouth, a gust of wind swept through the clearing. Tom caught a faint scent on the breeze, wood smoke and pine needles, the same smell that had permeated Maggie's cabin. "Did you smell that?" he asked excitedly. Mark shook his head, looking concerned. "Smell what, Mr. Harris?" Tom was about to explain when something caught his eye. There at the base of a large pine tree was a small object glinting in the sunlight. He rushed over and knelt down, brushing away leaves and dirt. His breath caught in his throat as he unearthed a small, tarnished ranger's badge. "Look," he said, holding it up for Mark to see. "This is proof. Maggie was real." Mark examined the badge, his brow furrowed. "It's old, that's for sure. But Mr. Harris, this doesn't prove anything. It could have been lost by any ranger over the years." But Tom wasn't listening. He clutched the badge tightly, tears welling in his eyes. "She was real," he whispered. "I knew it." As they made their way back to civilization, Tom felt a profound sense of peace settling over him. He hadn't found Maggie or her cabin, but he had found something perhaps more valuable, validation of his experience, and a deeper connection to the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life. Back at the ranger station, Tom reported their findings, including the encounter with the bear and the discovery of the badge. The rangers listened politely, but remained skeptical. As Tom prepared to leave the park, Ranger Coleman, the one who had told him about the legend of Maggie, approached him. "Mr. Harris," he said quietly, "I'm not supposed to encourage this kind of thing, but, well, some of us who've been here a long time, we believe there are things in these woods that can't be easily explained. Whatever you experienced out there, it was real to you, and maybe in some way that's what matters most." Tom nodded, grateful for the understanding. "Thank you, Ranger, for everything." As he drove home, the old ranger's badge safely tucked in his pocket, Tom reflected on his journey. He had come seeking concrete answers, but had instead found a deeper mystery, and a profound respect for the untamed wilderness. He thought of Maggie, whether spirit or flesh, and the lessons she had imparted. He thought of the bear and the moment of connection they had shared, and he thought of the vast, indifferent beauty of the forest, which had nearly killed him, and yet had also given him a new appreciation for life. Tom Harris had entered the wilderness a second time, not as a conqueror, but as a student. And while he hadn't found all the answers he sought, he had found something perhaps more valuable, a sense of peace, and a newfound harmony with the natural world. As he pulled into his driveway, seeing Sarah waiting anxiously on the porch, Tom knew that his journey wasn't over. The wilderness had left its mark on him, changing him in ways he was only beginning to understand. But now he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, carrying with him the wisdom of the forest and the memory of a mysterious woman who had shown him the true meaning of survival. The early morning mist clung to the forest floor as Park Ranger Emily Chen made her way along the trail. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, but something about the air felt different today. Maybe it was the unseasonable chill, or the eerie silence that seemed to have fallen over the woods. Whatever it was, it set Emily's nerves on edge. She paused at a fork in the path, consulting her map. That's when she noticed it, a set of fresh footprints veering off the marked trail and into the dense underbrush. "Damn tourists," she muttered, pulling out her radio. "Base, this is Chen. I've got signs of off-trail activity in Sector 7. Going to investigate," the radio crackled. "Copy that, Chen. Be careful out there." Emily followed the tracks, pushing through thick foliage. The further she went, the more uneasy she felt. These weren't the clumsy tracks of an inexperienced hiker. Whoever had come this way knew what they were doing. After about a mile, the tracks disappeared. Emily found herself in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. She was about to turn back when something caught her eye, a glint of metal beneath a nearby bush. Crouching down, she brushed aside the leaves to reveal a high-end GPS device, cracked and useless. Next to it lay a torn backpack, its contents strewn about. "Oh no," Emily breathed, her heart racing. This was no longer a simple case of an off-trail hiker. This was the sign of something much worse. She keyed her radio again. "Base, we've got a situation. I've found signs of a possible attack or accident, requesting immediate backup and search team." As Emily secured the area and waited for backup, her mind raced through the possibilities. Bear attack, mountain lion, or something even more sinister? Within an hour, the clearing was a hive of activity. Search and rescue teams combed the surrounding area while forensic experts examined the scene. Chief Ranger Mike Hawkins approached Emily, his face grim. "What do we know so far?" Emily shook her head. "Not much, no blood at the scene, which is good, but no signs of where they might have gone either." Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. "All right. We'll set up a command center here. I want teams sweeping in a 5-mile radius. And Chen, good work finding this. You may have just saved someone's life." As the day wore on, the search intensified. Helicopters buzzed overhead while teams of rangers and volunteers scoured the forest floor. Emily found herself paired with Sam, a seasoned tracker from the local indigenous community. "The spirits are restless today," Sam murmured, as they pushed through a particularly dense thicket. Emily glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Spirits?" Sam nodded solemnly. "These woods are old, Ranger Chen. They have seen much. And sometimes they keep secrets." Before Emily could respond, a shout rang out from nearby. They rushed towards the sound, emerging into another small clearing. There, leaning against a massive oak tree, was a man. He was in his mid-40s with a wild beard and tattered clothing. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and he was muttering to himself. Emily approached cautiously. "Sir, I'm Ranger Chen. Are you all right?" The man's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Emily. "She saved me," he rasped. "She brought me here." "Who saved you?" Emily asked gently, kneeling beside him. "Can you tell me what happened?" But the man just shook his head, his gaze drifting back to the forest. "Maggie, she knows, she always knows." Sam and Emily exchanged a look. "Sir, there's no one else here," Sam said. "Can you tell us your name?" The man blinked, seeming to come back to himself slightly. Tom Harris." Recognition flickered in Emily's mind. "Wait, Tom Harris? The hiker who went missing last year?" Tom nodded weakly. "I came back. I had to know. Had to find her. As medical." Personnel arrived to tend to Tom. Emily pulled Sam aside. "This doesn't make sense. Harris was rescued months ago. What's he doing back out here?" Sam's expression was thoughtful. Perhaps he left something behind. Something he needed to reclaim. Emily shook her head. "But who's this Maggie he keeps talking about? There was no mention of another person in his original report." As Tom was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, Emily noticed something clutched in his hand. Gently, she pried his fingers open to reveal a tarnished metal object, an old park ranger badge. Back at the command center, the atmosphere was a mix of relief and confusion. Tom Harris had been found alive, but his presence in the park raised more questions than answers. Chief Hawkins paced in front of the assembled team. "All right, let's go over what we know. Harris entered the park 3 days ago, alone. He went off trail almost immediately. We found his gear abandoned about 2 miles from where we found him. He's dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. And he keeps talking about someone named Maggie, who supposedly saved him." "Any thoughts?" Emily stepped forward, holding up the badge she'd taken from Tom. "Sir, I found this on Harris. It's an old ranger badge, at least 30 years out of date." Mike took the badge, examining it closely. His face paled slightly. This can't be." "What is it, Chief?" Emily asked. Mike looked up, his expression troubled. "This badge belonged to Margaret Hawkins, my aunt. She disappeared in these woods 15 years ago." A murmur ran through the assembled rangers. Emily felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool forest air. "But sir," she said, "how is that possible? Harris wasn't even in the park when your aunt disappeared." Mike shook his head. "I don't know. But I intend to find out." Over the next few days, as Tom recovered in the hospital, the story began to piece itself together. Tom had indeed come back to the park, driven by an obsession to prove that the mysterious woman who had saved him during his first ordeal was real. Emily sat by Tom's bedside, notebook in hand. "Mr. Harris, can you tell me exactly what happened out there?" Tom's eyes were clearer now, but there was still a haunted look in them. "I went back to where I thought I'd seen her cabin before, but it wasn't there. I searched for days, getting more and more lost. And then she found me again. This woman, Maggie," Emily prompted. Tom nodded. "She looked just like I remembered. Grey hair in a bun, weathered face. She said I shouldn't have come back, that some things in the forest need to remain mysteries." Emily leaned forward. "Mr. Harris, I need you to understand something. The woman you're describing, the one whose badge you had, she's been missing for 15 years. She'd be in her 70s now, if she's still alive." Tom's brow furrowed. "That's impossible. Maggie wasn't much older than me." As Emily left the hospital, her mind was whirling. None of this made sense. A missing ranger, a mysterious rescuer who didn't age, a man driven to the brink of madness by his experiences. What was really going on in those woods? Back at the ranger station, Emily found Mike poring over old maps and reports. "Chief, can I talk to you about something?" Mike looked up, gesturing for her to continue. Emily took a deep breath. "Sir, I've been thinking about Harris's story and your aunt and, well, some of the local legends. Is it possible that there's something out there we don't understand? Something that science can't explain?" Mike was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Chen, I've been a ranger in this park for 30 years. I've seen things that I can't explain. Rescues that seemed impossible. Hikers who survived against all odds. And always, there are whispers of a woman in the woods. A guardian angel, some call her. He stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the vast expanse of forest. I don't know what happened to my aunt all those years ago. I don't know what Harris experienced out there, but I do know this. These woods are ancient. They have their own rules, their own mysteries. And maybe, just maybe, they also have their own protectors. Emily joined him at the window, gazing out at the sea of green. She thought of Tom Harris of the old badge, of the stories Sam had told her about restless spirits. For the first time, she felt the true weight of the wilderness pressing in around her. "So what do we do?" she asked quietly. Mike turned to her, a small smile on his weathered face. "We do our job, Chen. We protect the park and its visitors. We respect the wilderness. And sometimes when someone comes stumbling out of the woods with a wild story about a mysterious rescuer, well, maybe we listen with an open mind." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest, Emily Chen realized that her understanding of the world had shifted. The wilderness was no longer just a place of trees and animals and geological features. It was alive in a way she had never before comprehended, full of secrets and wonders that defied explanation. And somewhere out there, moving silently between the ancient pines, perhaps there was a guardian, a protector, a mystery that would never be fully solved, but would continue to watch over those who ventured into the heart of the wild. The rhythmic beep of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Tom Harris slowly regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lighting. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. The sterile white walls a stark contrast to the lush green forest he'd been immersed in for days. "Tom? Can you hear me?" Sarah's voice, filled with worry and relief, cut through the fog in his mind. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. Sarah sat beside the bed, her face etched with exhaustion and concern. "Sarah," he croaked, his throat dry and raw. What happened?" Sarah leaned forward, grasping his hand tightly. "You've been in and out of consciousness for 3 days, Tom. They found you in the woods, delirious and dehydrated. Do you remember anything?" Tom closed his eyes, fragments of memories flashing through his mind. The search for Maggie's cabin, getting lost, the feeling of despair as he realized he'd made a terrible mistake. And then, warmth, safety, a familiar presence guiding him. "Maggie," he whispered. "She was there, Sarah. She saved me again." Sarah's face fell, a mix of disappointment and concern clouding her features. "Oh, Tom," she sighed. "The doctors said you might be confused. There was no one with you when they found you. You were alone." Before Tom could protest, the door opened, and a doctor entered, followed by a man in a park ranger uniform. "Mr. Harris," the doctor began, "I'm Dr. Patel. How are you feeling?" Tom tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back down. "I've been better," he admitted. Dr. Patel nodded sympathetically. "That's to be expected. You've been through quite an ordeal. We've treated you for dehydration and exposure, and you've got some nasty cuts and bruises, but overall, you're in remarkably good shape considering what you've been through." The park ranger stepped forward. "Mr. Harris, I'm Chief Ranger Mike Hawkins. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about what happened out there, if you're feeling up to it." Tom nodded, his gaze fixed on the ranger. There was something familiar about him, something he couldn't quite place. "Can you tell me why you went back into the park?" Hawkins asked gently. Tom took a deep breath, knowing how his answer would sound. "I had to find her. Maggie, the woman who saved me the first time. I know everyone thinks I imagined her, but she was real. I had to prove it." He saw Sarah and Dr. Patel exchange a concerned glance, but Ranger Hawkins's expression remained neutral. "And did you find what you were looking for?" the ranger pressed. Tom hesitated. How could he explain what had happened without sounding completely insane? I'm not sure," he finally said. "I got lost. I thought I was going to die out there. And then she was there again. Maggie. She led me to safety, just like before." Hawkins leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Can you describe this woman?" Tom closed his eyes, picturing Maggie's face. Grey hair in a tight bun, weathered face but kind eyes. She wore an old-style ranger uniform. When he opened his eyes, he was surprised to see a look of shock on Hawkins's face. "Mr. Harris," the ranger said slowly, The woman you're describing, she sounds exactly like my Aunt Margaret Hawkins. She was a ranger here, but she disappeared in those woods 15 years ago. A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah looked bewildered, Dr. Patel skeptical, but Tom felt a surge of vindication. "The badge," he said suddenly, trying to sit up again. "Where's the badge I found?" Ranger Hawkins reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished metal object. "You mean this?" Tom nodded eagerly. "Yes, that's Maggie's badge. She must have left it for me to find." Dr. Patel cleared his throat. "Mr. Harris, I think perhaps you need some rest. Your mind has been through a significant trauma, and it's not uncommon for patients in your situation to experience vivid hallucinations or false memories." But Tom shook his head vehemently. "No, you don't understand. This is proof. Maggie is real, and she's out there in those woods helping people." Sarah stood up, her face a mask of worry. "Tom, please, you're not making sense. There's no woman living in the woods. You were alone when they found you." Tom felt a wave of frustration wash over him. Why couldn't they understand? He turned to Ranger Hawkins, seeing a glimmer of something, doubt, curiosity in the man's eyes. "You believe me, don't you?" Tom pleaded. "You know there are things in those woods that can't be explained." Hawkins was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the old badge in his hand. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I've been a ranger in this park for 30 years, Mr. Harris. I've seen things that defy explanation, rescues that seemed impossible, hikers who survived against all odds." He paused, meeting Tom's eyes. "And always, there are whispers of a woman in the woods, a guardian angel, some call her." Dr. Patel looked uncomfortable. "Chief Hawkins, I'm not sure this line of conversation is helpful for Mr. Harris's recovery." But Tom felt energized, more alert than he had since waking up. "No, please, I need to understand what happened to me out there." Hawkins nodded slowly. "The truth is, Mr. Harris, these woods are ancient. They have their own rules, their own mysteries, and maybe, just maybe, they also have their own protectors." Sarah stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Tom needs rest and proper medical care, not ghost stories and folklore." As if on cue, a nurse entered the room. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours are over. Mr. Harris needs his rest." As everyone filed out, Tom caught Ranger Hawkins's sleeve. "Please," he said quietly, "I need to know more about your aunt, about Maggie, about what's really going on in those woods." Hawkins hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Get some rest, Mr. Harris. We'll talk again soon." That night, as Tom drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams were filled with images of the forest. He saw Maggie moving silently between the trees, her form sometimes solid, sometimes translucent. He heard her voice carried on the wind. "Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, Tom. The wilderness protects its own." When he awoke the next morning, Tom felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since before his first ill-fated hiking trip. He knew that his obsession with Maggie and the mysteries of the forest had nearly cost him everything: his marriage, his sanity, even his life. But he also knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that what he had experienced was real. As he lay there watching the sunrise paint the sky outside his window, Tom made a decision. He would heal, he would recover, and then he would find a way to honor the mystery of Maggie and the wilderness she protected, not by exposing her or trying to prove her existence, but by sharing the wisdom she had imparted, by teaching others to respect the wild, to understand its power and its dangers. A soft knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. Ranger Hawkins entered, looking slightly uncomfortable in the hospital setting. "Mr. Harris," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Tom shook his head. "Not at all. I was hoping we could talk more." Hawkins pulled up a chair, his expression serious. "Before we do, I need you to understand something. What we discuss here, it doesn't leave this room. The official report will state that you got lost, suffered from exposure and dehydration, and were found by our search teams. Is anything else? Well, that's between you, me, and the woods." Tom nodded, understanding the weight of what the ranger was offering. "I understand." For the next hour, Hawkins shared stories, tales of inexplicable rescues, of hikers guided to safety by a presence they couldn't see, of his own aunt's devotion to the forest she patrolled. Tom listened, enraptured, feeling pieces of a grand puzzle falling into place. As Hawkins prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Mr. Harris, whatever you experienced out there, it changed you. I can see it in your eyes. The question is, what are you going to do with that change?" Tom considered for a moment before answering. "I'm going to respect the mystery, Ranger Hawkins, and I'm going to do whatever I can to help others understand the true nature of the wilderness, its beauty, its danger, and its secrets." Hawkins nodded approvingly. "That, Mr. Harris, sounds like a worthy pursuit." He reached into his pocket and pulled out Maggie's old badge. "I think you should hold on to this, a reminder of what you've learned." As the door closed behind the ranger, Tom held the badge tightly, feeling its weight. Not just the physical weight, but the weight of the mystery it represented. He knew that his life had been irrevocably changed by his experiences in the woods. The man who had first set out to conquer the wilderness was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true meaning of respect and humility in the face of nature's power. Tom Harris closed his eyes, picturing the vast expanse of forest that had nearly claimed his life and had ultimately transformed it. Somewhere out there, moving silently between the ancient pines, was a guardian, a protector, a mystery that would never be fully solved, but would continue to watch over those who ventured into the heart of the wild. And Tom knew with unshakable certainty that he had been granted a rare gift, a glimpse behind the veil of the ordinary world into a realm where magic and reality intertwined. As he drifted off to sleep, Tom heard Maggie's voice one last time, carried on a phantom breeze that rustled through the sterile hospital room. "The wilderness will be waiting, Tom. It always is." The crisp mountain air carried a foreboding chill as Tom Harris stumbled through the dense undergrowth of Glacier National Park. What had begun as a solo hiking trip to prove his mettle against nature had devolved into a desperate fight for survival. Lost, dehydrated, and on the verge of collapse, Tom's mind began to play tricks on him. The shadows between the towering pines seemed to shift and move, taking on sinister forms. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Tom's foot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling face first onto the forest floor. He lay there, the taste of dirt and leaves filling his mouth as despair washed over him. It was in this moment of utter hopelessness that he first heard her voice. "Well now, what do we have here?" Tom's head snapped up, his eyes straining in the gathering darkness. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure that seemed to materialize from the very mist that clung to the forest floor. An older woman, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, regarded him with a mixture of concern and amusement. I'm lost," Tom managed to croak, his voice hoarse from dehydration. The woman clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Seems you're a bit more than lost, city boy. Looks to me like you're in a whole heap of trouble." As she helped Tom to his feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something otherworldly about this mysterious woman. Her touch was warm, undeniably real, and yet there was an ethereal quality to her presence that sent a shiver down Tom's spine. "Name's Maggie," she said, supporting Tom's weight as they began to move through the forest. "And you're lucky I found you when I did. These woods aren't kind to the unprepared." Tom tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but his mind was reeling. Where had this woman come from? How had she found him so deep in the wilderness? And why did she seem so at ease in this unforgiving environment? As they walked, Maggie's voice cut through the fog of Tom's exhaustion. "The forest has its own rules, you know, its own way of testing those who enter. You came here thinking you could conquer nature, didn't you?" Tom nodded weakly, shame coloring his cheeks. "I thought I was prepared. I thought I could handle anything the wilderness threw at me." Maggie's laugh was like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Oh, city boy, the wilderness isn't something to be handled or conquered. It's something to be respected, to be understood. You're just beginning to learn that lesson." As they crested a small hill, Tom's eyes widened in disbelief. There, nestled in a clearing that seemed to appear out of nowhere, stood a small, rustic cabin. Warm light spilled from its windows, promising safety and comfort. "Welcome to my humble abode," Maggie said, a hint of pride in her voice. "It's not much, but it's home." The interior of the cabin was cozy and lived in, filled with the scent of wood smoke and herbs. As Maggie busied herself preparing a medicinal tea, Tom's gaze wandered over the eclectic collection of items that filled the space. Old maps, pressed flowers, and curiously, what looked like an outdated park ranger uniform hanging on a peg by the door. "You were a ranger?" Tom asked, his voice stronger now that he had downed several cups of water. Maggie paused in her work, a shadow passing over her face. "A lifetime ago," she said softly. "The forest has been my home for, well, longer than you'd believe." As the night wore on and Tom's strength began to return, Maggie shared stories of the park, tales of daring rescues, close encounters with wildlife, and the profound beauty she'd witnessed over the years. Tom found himself hanging on every word, seeing the wilderness through new eyes. "But why are you out here alone?" Tom asked during a lull in the conversation. "Don't you get lonely?" Maggie's eyes took on a faraway look. "Lonely? No, never lonely. The forest is always alive, always changing. And sometimes it needs a guardian, someone to watch over those who lose their way." Tom felt a chill run down his spine at her words. There was something in the way she said it, something that hinted at a deeper mystery than he could comprehend. As dawn broke, Maggie led Tom back to the main trail. As they walked, she imparted wisdom that seemed to come from a place of deep, almost preternatural understanding of the wilderness. "Remember, city boy," she said as they reached the point where they would part ways, "the forest doesn't bend to your will. You must learn to bend with it, to move in harmony with its rhythms. Do that, and you might just survive out here." Tom turned to thank her, but the words died in his throat. Where Maggie had stood just moments before, there was nothing but empty air and swirling mist. He blinked, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. Had he imagined the entire encounter? But no, the strength in his limbs, the knowledge in his mind, these were real. Whatever had happened, whoever Maggie was, she had saved his life. As Tom made his way back to civilization, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had experienced something beyond the ordinary. The memory of Maggie's words echoed in his mind. The forest has its own rules, its own way of testing those who enter. In the days and weeks that followed, Tom's experience in the wilderness haunted him. He pored over maps of Glacier National Park, trying to pinpoint the location of Maggie's cabin, but to no avail. He reached out to park officials, asking about a former ranger named Maggie, only to be met with confused looks and dead ends. The rational part of Tom's mind tried to explain away his encounter. Stress, dehydration, a desperate mind conjuring a savior in his hour of need. But in his heart, he knew what he had experienced was real. The wisdom Maggie had imparted, the profound shift in his understanding of nature, these couldn't be the product of mere hallucination. As time passed, Tom found himself drawn back to the wilderness, not to conquer it, as he had once foolishly attempted, but to understand it, to honor the mystery of Maggie and the forest she protected. He began volunteering with the Park Service, sharing his story, albeit a sanitized version, with other hikers, teaching them to respect the wild and understand its power. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispered through the trees, Tom could swear he heard Maggie's voice carried on the breeze. "The wilderness will be waiting, Tom, it always is." The legend of the Phantom Ranger of Glacier National Park grew, whispered around campfires, and passed down among seasoned hikers. A mysterious woman, appearing in moments of dire need, guiding the lost to safety before vanishing without a trace. Some dismissed it as folklore, a comforting myth in the face of nature's indifference. Others, like Tom, knew better, for in the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park, where ancient forests stand sentinel over glacial valleys, there are mysteries that defy explanation, and perhaps, just perhaps, there are guardians who watch over those who venture into the heart of the wild, embodying the very spirit of the wilderness itself. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. James Miller gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the winding mountain road leading into Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows across the windshield. In the passenger seat, his wife Linda pored over a map of the park, while their 12-year-old son Jake bounced excitedly in the back seat. "Are we almost there, Dad?" Jake asked for what felt like the 100th time. James chuckled, glancing at his son in the rearview mirror. Just a few more miles, buddy. We'll be at the campground before you know it. Linda folded the map and turned to face Jake. Remember what we talked about, sweetie. This isn't like camping in the backyard. We need to be careful and respectful of the wildlife. Jake rolled his eyes. I know, Mom. Don't feed the animals, store food properly, and make lots of noise on the trails. You've only told me 1,000,000 times. And I'll tell you 1,000,000 more if it keeps us safe, Linda replied, a hint of worry in her voice. As they rounded a bend in the road, the trees parted to reveal a breathtaking vista of the Smoky Mountains. Mist clung to the distant peaks, giving the landscape an otherworldly quality. James pulled the car into a small overlook, and the family climbed out to stretch their legs and take in the view. Wow, Jake whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. It's like something out of a movie. James wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. It sure is, kiddo, and we get to spend the whole week exploring it. Linda snapped a few photos with her phone before ushering the family back into the car. Come on, you two. We need to set up camp before it gets dark. 20 minutes later, they pulled into the campground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke as other campers settled in for the evening. James found their assigned spot and parked the car. All right, Team Miller, he announced, clapping his hands together. Let's get this camp set up. They worked together to unload the car, falling into a familiar rhythm. James and Jake tackled the tent while Linda organized their supplies. As Jake hammered in the last tent stake, a park ranger approached their site. Evening, folks, the ranger greeted them with a friendly smile. I'm Ranger Sarah. Just wanted to welcome you to the park and see if you had any questions. Linda wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped forward. Actually, yes. We've been reading about bear activity in the area. Should we be concerned? Ranger. Sarah's expression grew serious. Well, we always want campers to be bear-aware. There have been a few sightings in the area recently, but nothing too unusual for this time of year. Jake's eyes widened with a mix of excitement and apprehension. We're going to see bears. Not if we can help it, young man, Ranger Sarah replied. Bears generally want to avoid humans as much as we want to avoid them, but it's important to know what to do if you encounter one. She spent the next few minutes going over bear safety protocols with the family. James listened intently, nodding along while Linda took mental notes. Jake, however, seemed distracted, his gaze constantly drifting to the surrounding forest. As Ranger Sarah prepared to leave, she added, One last thing. We're having a bear safety talk at the amphitheater in about an hour. I highly recommend attending, especially for first-time campers in bear country. We'll be there, James assured her. Thanks for all the information. After the ranger left, the family finished setting up their campsite. James double-checked the bear-proof food locker, while Linda inflated their sleeping pads inside the tent. Jake collected firewood from the designated pile near their site, his movements quick and agitated. You okay, Jake? James asked, noticing his son's nervous energy. Jake shrugged, dropping an armful of wood next to the fire pit. Just thinking about the bears, I guess. Do you really think we'll see one? James knelt down to Jake's level, looking him in the eye. It's possible, but remember what Ranger Sarah said. If we're smart and follow the rules, we shouldn't have any problems. Besides, your old man will protect you. Jake managed a small smile. Thanks, Dad. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the campground, the Millers made their way to the amphitheater for the bear safety talk. They joined a small crowd of other campers, a mix of families, couples, and solo backpackers. Ranger. Sarah stood at the front, flanked by informational posters about local wildlife. She began the talk with a friendly but firm tone. Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see so many of you here. Understanding how to coexist with the wildlife in this park, especially bears, is crucial for both your safety and the well-being of the animals. For the next 45 minutes, she covered everything from proper food storage to what to do in case of an actual bear encounter. Jake listened with rapt attention, his earlier nervousness giving way to fascination. As the talk concluded, Linda leaned over to James and whispered, Maybe we should have left the cheese puffs at home. James squeezed her hand reassuringly. Don't worry. We've got the bear locker and we'll be extra careful. Back at their campsite, the family worked together to build a fire. As flames licked at the dry wood, casting a warm glow over their little corner of the wilderness. They settled into their camp chairs for dinner. Linda passed out sandwiches and apples, pointedly avoiding the bag of cheese puffs hidden away in their food supplies. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" she asked between bites. James pulled out a trail map, holding it close to the firelight. "I was thinking we could try the Alum Cave Trail. It's supposed to have some amazing views, and it's not too strenuous for Jake." "Sounds good to me." Linda agreed. "Jake, what do you think?" But Jake wasn't listening. He sat rigid in his chair, staring intently into the darkness beyond their campfire's glow. "Jake?" James prompted, following his son's gaze. "What is it, buddy?" Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought I saw something move out there. In the trees." The adults exchanged a concerned look. James stood up slowly, grabbing the flashlight from the picnic table. He shone the beam into the forest, the light catching on leaves and branches, but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. "I don't see anything, Jake," James said, trying to keep his voice calm. "It was probably just the wind or a small animal." Linda began gathering up the remnants of their dinner. "Either way, I think it's time we got everything cleaned up and secured." For the night, they worked quickly and quietly, hyper-aware of every snapping twig and rustling leaf around them. James triple-checked the bear locker, making sure it was securely latched. As they prepared for bed, brushing teeth and changing into pajamas, an uneasy silence fell over the family. The excitement of their arrival had given way to a palpable tension. Inside the tent, Jake snuggled deep into his sleeping bag, his eyes wide and alert. "Dad," he whispered. "Yeah, buddy? What if a bear does come to our campsite?" James reached out to ruffle his son's hair. "Then we'll do exactly what Ranger Sarah taught us. We'll stay calm, make ourselves look big, and slowly back away. But don't worry, the chances of that happening are very small." Linda added, "And remember, we stored all our food and scented items in the bear locker. There's nothing here to attract them." Jake nodded, seemingly reassured. "Okay. Good night, Mom. Good night, Dad." "Good night, sweetheart," Linda murmured, zipping up her own sleeping bag. As the family settled in for the night, the sounds of the forest enveloped them. The gentle rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets. It was a symphony of wilderness that was both beautiful and slightly unnerving. James lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of his wife and son. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's eyes in the darkness hadn't been playing tricks on him. What if there really was something out there, watching their campsite? He tried to push the thought from his mind, reminding himself of all the precautions they had taken. They were safe. They were prepared. Tomorrow would bring a new day of adventures and memories. But as James finally drifted off to sleep, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond their tent, followed by the soft sound of heavy footfalls moving through the underbrush. Jake's eyes snapped open, his bladder uncomfortably full. The interior of the tent was pitch black, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Then the memories of their arrival at Great Smoky Mountains National Park came flooding back. He listened to the soft snoring of his parents and the unfamiliar night sounds of the forest beyond the thin fabric walls. Hesitantly, Jake unzipped his sleeping bag and fumbled for the flashlight next to his pillow. He paused, debating whether to wake his parents. The thought of venturing outside alone made his heart race, but he didn't want them to think he was a baby. "I can do this," he whispered to himself, gathering his courage. As quietly as possible, Jake unzipped the tent flap and stepped out into the cool night air. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty campsite. Everything looked different, almost alien in the harsh light and deep shadows. Jake made his way to the edge of their site, where a small path led to the communal bathrooms. He kept the flashlight trained on the ground, careful not to trip over any roots or rocks. The silence of the forest was occasionally broken by the rustle of leaves or the hoot of a distant owl making him jump. Halfway to the bathrooms, Jake froze. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness to his left. He swung the flashlight in that direction, his hand shaking slightly. The beam caught the reflective eyes of a small animal, probably a raccoon, before it scurried away into the underbrush. Jake let out a shaky laugh, relieved it wasn't something larger. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. After quickly using the bathroom, Jake hurried back towards the campsite, eager to return to the relative safety of the tent. As he approached, he swept his flashlight across the area, making sure nothing had disturbed their setup in his absence. That's when he saw it, a large, dark shape moving at the edge of the tree line. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The shape was much bigger than a raccoon, its movements deliberate and powerful. As he stood rooted to the spot, the beam of his flashlight caught the unmistakable silhouette of a bear. Time seemed to stand still. Jake's mind raced through everything he'd learned from Ranger Sarah's talk. Don't run. Make yourself look big, back away slowly. But his body refused to cooperate, frozen in fear. The bear, seemingly unaware of Jake's presence, continued to lumber along the edge of the campsite. It paused near the bear locker, raising its nose to sniff the air. Jake's heart pounded so loudly, he was sure the bear would hear it. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, the bear moved on, disappearing into the dense forest beyond their campsite. Jake remained motionless for several more moments, straining his eyes and ears for any sign of the animal's return. Finally, his paralysis broke. Jake sprinted back to the tent, his feet barely touching the ground. He practically dove through, the tent flap zipping it shut behind him with trembling hands. "Mom! Dad!" he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Wake up!" Linda stirred first, sitting up groggily. "Jake! What's wrong, honey?" James rolled over, instantly alert at the panic in his son's voice. "What happened? Are you okay?" Jake's words tumbled out in a rush. "There's a bear, I saw it. It was right there by the trees." Linda's eyes widened in alarm. "A bear, are you sure?" "I'm positive," Jake insisted. "It was huge. It went by the bear locker and then into the woods." James reached for the flashlight, his movements calm, but purposeful. "Okay, let's everyone take a deep breath. Jake, tell us exactly what you saw." As Jake recounted his encounter, James and Linda exchanged worried glances. They had known bear sightings were possible, even likely, but having one so close to their campsite on the very first night was unsettling. "What should we do?" Linda asked, her voice tight with anxiety. James thought for a moment. "First, we stay calm. The bear is gone now and we're safe in the tent. In the morning, we'll talk to Ranger Sarah and report the sighting." "But what if it comes back?" Jake's voice quavered. "Then we'll handle it," James assured him. "Remember what we learned? We make noise, stick together, and back away slowly. But right now, the best thing we can do is try to get some sleep." Linda pulled Jake close, stroking his hair. "Your father's right, sweetie. We're prepared and we're together. That's what matters." Despite his parents' reassurances, Jake found it impossible to relax. Every sound outside the tent, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, made him flinch. He lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, imagining the bear's return. James, sensing his son's distress, spoke softly in the darkness. "Hey, Jake, want to hear about the time your grandpa and I went camping and thought we saw Bigfoot?" Jake turned towards his father's voice, grateful for the distraction. "Really?" "Oh, yeah," James chuckled. "We were up in the Pacific Northwest, deep in the woods. It was a night just like this one." As James spun his tale, embellishing the details for Jake's benefit, the tension in the tent gradually eased. Linda smiled to herself, appreciating her husband's effort to calm their son. By the time James finished his story, Jake's eyelids were growing heavy. The fear of the bear sighting still lingered, but it was overshadowed by the comfort of his parents' presence and the amusing image of his dad and grandpa mistaking a moose for Bigfoot. "Thanks, Dad," Jake murmured sleepily. "Anytime, buddy," James replied, reaching out to ruffle Jake's hair. "Try to get some sleep now. We've got a big day of hiking ahead of us tomorrow." As Jake drifted off, Linda whispered to James, "Do you think we should leave in the morning?" James sighed, considering the question. "Let's see what Ranger Sarah says. If she thinks there's a real danger, we'll pack up. But bears are part of the park. We can't let one sighting ruin our whole trip." Linda nodded, unconvinced but willing to wait for more information. "I just hope Jake will be okay. He was so excited about this trip, and now—" "He's tougher than we give him credit for," James assured her. "This might even end up being a good experience for him, learning to face his fears and all that." As the Millers finally settled back to sleep, The forest outside continued its nightly symphony. The bear, unaware of the commotion it had caused, foraged peacefully in a berry patch half a mile away. With the first light of dawn, Jake's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, the events of the night felt like a distant dream. But as he became fully awake, the memory of the bear came rushing back, sending a shiver down his spine. He sat up, noticing his parents were already awake and talking in hushed tones. "Morning, champ," James said, forcing a cheerful note into his voice. "How'd you sleep?" Jake shrugged. "Okay, I guess. Is the bear gone?" Linda smiled reassuringly. "I'm sure it is, honey. Your dad went out to check the campsite and everything looks normal. We're going to talk to Ranger Sarah after breakfast just to be safe." As they emerged from the tent, Jake scanned the area nervously, half expecting to see the bear lurking nearby. But the campground was peaceful, filled with the sounds of other campers starting their day. James clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder. "See? Nothing to worry about. Now, who's ready for some breakfast? I think we've earned ourselves some of those chocolate chip pancakes your mum packed." As they prepared breakfast, the family fell into a semblance of normalcy. Jake's fear began to fade in the warm morning sunlight, replaced by a growing sense of excitement. He had seen a real, wild bear. How many of his friends back home could say that? "Hey, Dad," Jake said between mouthfuls of pancake. "Do you think we might see the bear again, from far away?" James and Linda exchanged surprised looks. "Maybe, buddy," James replied cautiously. "But remember, we need to keep our distance and respect their space. Bears are wild animals, not tourist attractions." Jake nodded solemnly. "I know, I just think it would be cool to see one again, as long as it's not right next to our tent." Linda laughed, relief evident in her voice. "Well, I'm glad you're feeling better about it. Now let's clean up and go find Ranger Sarah. We've got a big day of hiking ahead of us." As they walked towards the ranger station, Jake found himself scanning the tree line, not with fear, but with a newfound curiosity about the wild inhabitants of the park. The night's encounter, while terrifying in the moment, had awakened something in him, a deeper appreciation for the raw, untamed nature that surrounded them. The Miller family's Great Smoky Mountains adventure was just beginning. And despite the rocky start, Jake felt ready to face whatever challenges the wilderness might bring. As long as they stuck together, he knew they could handle anything, even a curious black bear in the night. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of oak and hickory trees, casting dappled shadows across the Alum Cave Trail. The Miller family hiked in single file, with James leading the way, followed by Jake and Linda bringing up the rear. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the lingering tension from the previous night's bear encounter. "How much further, Dad?" Jake called out, his earlier enthusiasm waning as the trail steepened. James consulted the map tucked into his backpack strap. "We're about halfway to Alum Cave Bluffs, should be another mile or so. How are you holding up?" Jake wiped sweat from his brow. "I'm okay, just tired." Linda chimed in from behind. "We can take a break if you need to, sweetie." "No, I'm fine," Jake insisted, pushing forward with renewed determination. As they continued their ascent, the forest around them seemed to come alive. A pileated woodpecker's staccato drumming echoed through the trees, and a flash of red caught their eyes as a cardinal darted across the path. James slowed his pace, falling in step beside Jake. "So what do you think of the hike so far?" Jake's eyes scanned the surrounding forest before answering. "It's pretty cool, different from the campground." "How so?" James prodded, sensing there was more on his son's mind. Jake hesitated, then spoke, in a low voice. "It feels wilder out here, like anything could be watching us from the trees." James nodded, understanding the mix of excitement and apprehension in his son's voice. "That's part of the beauty of places like this, Jake. We're guests in their home." As if on cue, a rustling in the underbrush off to their right caused all three Millers to freeze. Jake's hand instinctively grabbed his father's arm, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. A moment later, a doe and her fawn emerged from the foliage, regarding the family with calm curiosity before bounding away up the slope. Linda let out a relieved laugh. Well, that was magical. The encounter seemed to lift everyone's spirits, and they continued their hike with renewed energy. Jake's steps became lighter, his gaze constantly darting around in hopes of spotting more wildlife. As they neared Alum Cave Bluffs, the trail became more challenging, with steep drop-offs to one side. Linda's voice carried a note of concern. "James, are you sure this is safe for Jake?" Before James could respond, Jake piped up, "I can handle it, Mom. I'm not a little kid anymore." James smiled proudly at his son's determination. "He's right, Linda. Besides, we're almost there. Wait until you see the view. It'll be worth it." True to James's word, the trail soon opened up to reveal Alum Cave Bluffs, a massive concave cliff face that loomed over them. The Millers stood in awe, taking in the breathtaking vista of the surrounding mountains. "Wow," Jake whispered, his earlier fatigue forgotten. "This is amazing." They weren't alone in their appreciation. Several other hikers milled about, some resting on rocks, others taking photos. As the Millers found a spot to sit and have a snack, they overheard snippets of conversation from a nearby group. "Yeah, there have been a few bear sightings in the area recently," a gruff-looking man in his 60s was saying. "My buddy who works as a ranger says they've had to close off a few campsites because of it." Jake's head snapped up at the mention of bears, his sandwich forgotten in his hand. James and Linda exchanged worried glances. The man continued, unaware of the effect his words were having on the family. "Apparently, there's one big male that's been getting a bit too comfortable around humans. They're worried he might become aggressive if he loses his fear entirely." Linda leaned in close to James, whispering, "Do you think that could have been the bear Jake saw last night?" James shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant for Jake's sake. "Could be, but there are lots of bears in the park. Let's not jump to conclusions." Despite James' reassurances, a palpable unease had settled over the family. The majestic view of the mountains suddenly seemed to hold hidden dangers, the dense forests below concealing unknown threats. As they prepared to head back down the trail, Jake's earlier enthusiasm had dimmed considerably. He stuck close to his parents, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding wilderness. The hike down was considerably quieter than their ascent. Even the forest seemed more ominous now, the rustling leaves and snapping twigs taking on a more sinister quality in their imagination. About halfway down the trail, they encountered a park ranger heading up, his uniform a welcome sight in the growing tension. "Afternoon, folks," the ranger greeted them cheerfully. "Enjoying the hike?" James nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, it's beautiful up there. Say, we couldn't help overhearing some talk about increased bear activity in the area. Is there anything we should be concerned about?" The ranger's expression grew serious. "Well, we always want hikers and campers to be bear aware. There has been an uptick in sightings, but that's not unusual for this time of year. Just make sure to store your food properly and make noise while you hike. Bears generally want to avoid humans as much as we want to avoid them." Linda stepped forward, lowering her voice. "Our son, he thinks he saw a bear near our campsite last night. Should we be worried?" The ranger knelt down to Jake's level. "Is that right, young man? Can you tell me what you saw?" Jake recounted his experience, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. The ranger listened attentively, nodding along. "Sounds like you handled that situation perfectly," the ranger said, giving Jake an approving smile. "You did the right thing by staying calm and alerting your parents. As for the bear, it was probably just passing through looking for food. They're naturally curious creatures, but they're not out to get us." Jake seemed to relax a bit at the ranger's words. "So, we're safe?" Safe as anyone can be in the wilderness," the ranger replied honestly. "Nature isn't a zoo or an amusement park. There are always risks, but if we respect the wildlife and follow proper procedures, we can coexist safely." As they bid farewell to the ranger and continued their descent, the family fell into thoughtful silence. The encounter had brought their concerns to the surface, but it had also provided some reassurance. Back at the campground, the Millers went about setting up for the evening, their movements more deliberate and cautious than the previous day. James double-checked the bear locker, ensuring all their food and scented items were securely stored. As they sat around the campfire that evening, roasting marshmallows, Linda broached the subject they'd all been tiptoeing around. "So, what do you all think? Should we cut the trip short?" Jake looked up, surprise and disappointment clear on his face. "What? No, we can't leave yet. We've barely started exploring." James watched his son carefully. Are you sure, Jake? After what happened last night and what we heard today? It's okay if you're scared. Jake was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. When he spoke, his voice was soft but determined. I am scared a little, but I don't want to leave. This place is amazing and I want to learn how to be brave in the wilderness, like you and Mom. Pride swelled in James's chest. He reached out and squeezed Jake's shoulder. That's my boy. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, it means you face your fears. Linda nodded, a mix of concern and admiration on her face. All right then, we'll stay, but we need to be extra careful, okay? No wandering off alone, and we make noise when we're on the trails. As the fire died down and the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, the Millers prepared for bed. The day's hike had left them physically exhausted, but mentally invigorated. The wilderness around them still held its dangers, but it no longer felt as overwhelming. Jake crawled into his sleeping bag, his muscles aching pleasantly from the day's exertion. As he drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, no longer seemed ominous. Instead, they were a reminder of the wild beauty that surrounded them, a world he was slowly learning to navigate and appreciate. Outside the tent, in the darkness beyond the dying embers of their campfire, a twig snapped under the weight of a heavy paw. A large shape moved silently through the shadows, drawn by the lingering scent of roasted marshmallows and the promise of easy food. The bear, the same one Jake had spotted the night before, paused at the edge of the campsite, its nostrils flaring as it tested the air. For now, the bear locker held firm, denying the animal its prize. With a low grunt of frustration, the bear turned and lumbered back into the forest. But it would return, its growing boldness around human campsites driving it to seek out these new and intriguing food sources. As the Millers slept peacefully in their tent, unaware of their midnight visitor, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test their newfound courage and forever change their perception of the wild. The Millers' second night in Great Smoky Mountains National Park had passed uneventfully, lulling them into a false sense of security. As the family settled in for their third night, the air hung heavy with an unseasonable warmth, promising a restless sleep. Inside the tent, Jake tossed and turned, his sleeping bag twisted around his legs. The day's hike to Klingman's Dome had left him exhausted, but sleep eluded him. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs outside set his nerves on edge. Linda's voice cut through the darkness, barely above a whisper. "James, are you awake?" "Yeah," came the groggy reply. "What's up?" "I don't know. I just have this feeling like something's not right." James propped himself up on one elbow, straining his ears. The night seemed unusually quiet, the typical chorus of crickets and frogs conspicuously absent. "It's probably nothing," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just the weather making us jumpy." Jake's small voice piped up, "I can't sleep either." Linda reached out, finding Jake's hand in the darkness. "It's okay, sweetie. Try to close your eyes and think about something nice." For a few moments the family lay in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Then a sound cut through the night, a low, huffing grunt, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. James bolted upright. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could respond, a much louder noise erupted outside, the crash of metal hitting the ground, followed by the ripping of plastic. "Oh, God," Linda gasped. "The bear locker!" Jake's breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Dad, what do we do?" James moved with careful deliberation, unzipping his sleeping bag. "Okay, everyone stay calm. I'm going to take a look." "James!" "No," Linda hissed, grabbing his arm. "It's too dangerous. We need to know what we're dealing with," James insisted, though his voice trembled slightly. "I'll be careful, I promise." Slowly, James unzipped the tent flap, wincing at each rasping sound. He poked his head out, fumbling with the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of chaos. The bear locker lay on its side, its door wrenched open. Amidst the scattered contents of their food supply stood an enormous black bear, its muzzle buried in a bag of trail mix. James's sharp intake of breath alerted the bear to his presence. The animal's head snapped up, eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam. For a heartbeat, man and beast stared at each other, frozen in mutual surprise. Then the bear let out a low, rumbling growl. James's survival instincts kicked in. He remembered the ranger's advice. Make yourself look big, make noise, back away slowly. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the tent, arms raised above his head. "Hey, bear!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Get out of here! Go on! Get!" The bear rose to its hind legs, towering over James. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Inside the tent, Linda clutched Jake close, her heart pounding. "James!" she cried out. "James, please come back!" The bear dropped back to all fours and took a lumbering step towards James. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the tent's guy line. "Linda!" James called, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need you to grab the bear spray from my backpack, slowly." Linda fumbled in the darkness, her hands shaking as she unzipped James's pack. "I can't find it," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "It's there. Keep looking," James urged, not daring to take his eyes off the bear. He continued to shout and wave his arms, but the bear seemed more annoyed than frightened by his display. Jake watched the silhouette of his father against the tent, facing down the massive bear. Terror gripped him, but beneath it, a spark of determination flickered to life. His dad needed help. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Jake unzipped his sleeping bag and crawled towards the tent opening. "Jake, no!" Linda cried, reaching for him, but he had already slipped out. The cool night air hit Jake like a slap, sharpening his senses. He saw his father backing away from the advancing bear, flashlight beam dancing wildly. In that moment, all his fear transformed into a fierce need to protect his family. Grabbing a nearby pot, Jake began banging it with all his might. "Hey!" he shouted, his young voice cracking. "Leave my dad alone!" The sudden noise startled the bear, causing it to wheel around towards Jake. James's heart leapt into his throat. "Jake, get back in the tent now!" But Jake stood his ground, continuing to create a cacophony with the pot and spoon. The bear, confused by the multiple threats, swung its head back and forth between James and Jake. Linda emerged from the tent, clutching the bear spray. "James, catch!" she called, tossing the can to her husband. James snatched it out of the air, fumbling with the safety cap. The bear, agitated by the commotion, let out another thunderous roar. "Everyone back up slowly," James instructed, his finger poised over the spray nozzle. "Linda, get Jake behind you." The family inched backward, huddled together. The bear watched them, nostrils flaring, torn between its fear of the humans and the temptation of the scattered food. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, the blast of an air horn. Flashlight beams danced through the trees as voices called out. "Hey, bear, move along!" Park rangers emerged from the forest, air horns blaring and flashlights waving. The bear, finally overwhelmed, turned and lumbered off into the darkness, pausing only to snatch a package of beef jerky in its massive jaws. As the bear disappeared into the forest, the Millers stood frozen, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. A ranger approached them, his face etched with concern. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, scanning them for injuries. James nodded numbly, his arm wrapped protectively around Jake's shoulders. "We're okay, just shaken up." Linda sank to her knees, pulling Jake into a tight embrace. "Oh, sweetie," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "You were so brave. So brave." Jake buried his face in his mother's shoulder, his small body trembling as the full weight of what had just happened washed over him. The ranger surveyed the scattered contents of the bear locker. "Looks like this fella's been causing trouble all over the campground. We've been trying to track him down." James ran a hand through his hair, still clutching the unused bear spray. "He came out of nowhere. We thought we'd done everything right with the food storage, but sometimes, no matter how careful we are, these things happen," the ranger said sympathetically. "The important thing is you're all safe. You handled it well, keeping your distance and making noise." As other rangers arrived to help clean up the campsite, the Miller family huddled together, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from their systems. The reality of how close they had come to disaster began to sink in. Jake looked up at his father, his eyes wide. "Dad, are we going to go home now?" James exchanged a long look with Linda. The fear was still there in her eyes, but beneath it was a steely resolve. He knew they were thinking the same thing. Running away now would only cement this night as a traumatic memory. Staying, facing their fears, could turn it into something else, a story of courage and family unity. "No, buddy," James said finally, squeezing Jake's shoulder. "We're not going home, not unless you want to. This is part of the adventure, remember? Sometimes it's scary, but we face it together." Jake nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Together," he repeated, as the rangers helped them secure a new bear locker and set up a temporary patrol around the campsite. The Millers began to relax. The night's events, while terrifying, had shown them something about themselves, a resilience and courage they hadn't known they possessed. Later, as they huddled in their tent, too wired to sleep, Linda broke the silence. "I've never been so scared in my life," she admitted, "but seeing you two out there standing your ground, I've also never been so proud." James reached out, finding her hand in the darkness. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" "The best," Jake chimed in, his voice muffled by his sleeping bag. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, the Millers finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted but oddly exhilarated. They had faced one of nature's most formidable creatures and come out the other side, not unscathed, but unbroken. Outside, the forest began to stir with morning birdsong, the drama of the night fading into memory. But somewhere in the depths of the woods, a large black bear licked the last traces of beef jerky from its muzzle, already planning its next foray into the world of humans and their intriguing, irresistible food. The morning after the bear, as attack dawned bright and clear, but the Miller family's nerves remained frayed. They emerged from their tent bleary-eyed and exhausted, having managed only a few fitful hours of sleep. The campsite, tidied by the rangers the night before, bore little evidence of the terrifying encounter, save for a few scattered wrappers the wind had caught. James busied himself with starting a fire for breakfast, his movements mechanical and distracted. Linda sat at the picnic table, absently running her fingers over a deep scratch in the wood, a stark reminder of the bear's powerful claws. Jake hovered close to his parents, his usual energetic chatter replaced by watchful silence. As James set a pot of water to boil for coffee, a park ranger approached their site. It was Sarah, the ranger who had given them the bear safety talk on their first day. "Good morning, folks," she called out, her tone gentle but professional. "I heard about what happened last night. How is everyone holding up?" Linda managed a weak smile. "We're okay, a bit shaken, but okay." Ranger Sarah nodded sympathetically. "That's understandable. Mind if I join you for a few minutes? I'd like to go over what happened and talk about next steps." James gestured to the picnic table. "Please, have a seat. Coffee?" "That'd be great, thanks." As James poured cups of strong black coffee for the adults, Jake inched closer to the table, his curiosity overcoming his lingering fear. Ranger Sarah smiled at him. "Hey there, Jake. I heard you were quite the hero last night." Jake shrugged, a hint of pride breaking through his somber demeanor. "I was scared, but I couldn't let the bear hurt my dad." "That was very brave of you," Sarah said. "But also very dangerous. In the future, it's best to stay inside the tent and let the adults handle the situation, okay?" Jake nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah turned her attention to James and Linda. "Now, can you walk me through exactly what happened? Every detail helps us track and manage the bear population." As James recounted the events of the previous night, Linda reached out and took Jake's hand, squeezing it gently. The ranger listened intently, jotting down notes in a small pad. "Based on your description and reports from other campers, we believe this is a bear we've been tracking for a while," Sarah explained when James finished. "He's become increasingly bold around humans, which is a dangerous situation for both the bear and campers." "What will happen to him?" Jake asked, his voice small. Sarah's expression turned serious. "Well, Jake, that depends. We're going to try to trap and relocate him first. But if he continues to seek out human food and show no fear of people, we might have to consider more drastic measures." "You mean kill him?" Jake's eyes widened in horror. "Only as an absolute last resort," Sarah assured him quickly. "We do everything we can to avoid that outcome. That's why it's so important for campers to follow proper food storage procedures and report any bear activity immediately." James leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "We thought we did everything right. With the bear locker, How did he manage to break into it? Sarah sighed. Unfortunately, some bears are smart enough to figure out how to open even the most secure containers. This particular bear has learned that human sights mean easy food, and he's strong enough to force his way in if he's determined. A heavy silence fell over the campsite as the family absorbed this information. The forest around them, which had seemed so magical just days ago, now felt fraught with hidden dangers. Linda was the first to speak. So, what do we do now? Should we leave? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. That's entirely up to you. We've increased patrols in this area, and we're setting up traps to try and catch this bear. The chance of another encounter is low, but I can't promise it won't happen. She paused, looking each family member in the eye. What I can say is this. You've faced one of the scariest situations a camper can encounter, and you handled it remarkably. Well, you have knowledge and experience now that many never get. If you choose to stay, you'll be better prepared than most. James and Linda exchanged a long look, years of shared understanding passing between them. Then, as one, they turned to Jake. What do you think, buddy? James asked. It's your vacation too. Do you want to go home or stick it out? Jake bit his lip, his young face scrunched in concentration. The adults waited patiently, allowing him time to process his thoughts and emotions. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice quiet but determined. I want to stay. I'm still scared, but I don't want the bear to win. This is our trip and I want to finish it. Pride swelled in James's chest. He reached out and ruffled Jake's hair. That's my boy, Linda. Linda took a deep breath, conflict clear on her face. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't terrified. But Jake's right. We can't let fear control us. We'll stay, but we need to be extra vigilant. Ranger Sarah nodded approvingly. I think that's a wise decision. Tell you what, why don't you pack up your gear and move to a different campsite? We have one closer to the ranger station that's just opened up. You'll have a bit more security there, and it might help everyone feel more at ease. The Millers agreed and spent the next hour packing up their belongings. As they worked, a sense of purpose seemed to energize them, pushing away the lingering fear and exhaustion. Their new campsite, while less secluded than the previous one, offered a commanding view of the surrounding forest. Jake helped his father set up the tent, his earlier reticence giving way to excited chatter about the day's potential adventures. Dad, can we go see the waterfalls today? Please? Jake bounced on his toes, pointing to a spot on the park map. James chuckled, relieved to see his son's spirit returning. I don't see why not. What do you think, Linda? Up for a hike to Grotto Falls? Linda, who had been meticulously organizing their supplies in the new bear locker, looked up with a smile. Actually, that sounds perfect. A change of scenery might do us all some good. As they prepared for their hike, the family moved with a new awareness of their surroundings. James triple-checked the bear spray on his belt, while Linda made sure their backpacks didn't contain anything scented that might attract wildlife. Jake, for his part, seemed to vibrate with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. As they set off down the trail, he peppered his parents with questions. Do bears like waterfalls? Can they swim? What if we see one on the trail? Can I carry the bear spray? James laughed, ruffling Jake's hair. Whoa, slow down there, champ. One question at a time. Yes, bears can swim. No, you can't carry the bear spray. That's for adults only. And if we see a bear on the trail, we'll do exactly what Ranger Sarah taught us. Make noise, stay together, and back away slowly. Remember? Jake nodded solemnly. I remember, but do you think we will see one? Linda put a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. It's very unlikely, sweetie. Bears usually avoid humans, especially on busy trails like this one. Last night was unusual, as they hiked. The family remained vigilant, but also found themselves relaxing into the rhythm of the forest. The sound of their boots on the dirt path, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant roar of the approaching waterfall created a soothing symphony. When they reached Grotto Falls, the sight took their breath away. Water cascaded over, a rocky overhang, creating a curtain of mist and rainbows. The cool spray on their faces was refreshing after the warm hike. Wow, Jake whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. It's like something out of a movie. James nodded, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. It sure is, buddy. This is why we come to places like this, to see things we can't see anywhere else. As they stood there, marveling at the power and beauty of nature, Linda felt a shift in the air. The fear that had gripped them since the bear encounter began to loosen its hold, replaced by a deep appreciation for the wild world around them. "You know," she said softly, "I'm glad we decided to stay. As scary as last night was, I wouldn't trade this moment for anything." James pulled her close, planting a kiss on her forehead. "Me neither. We're making memories that'll last a lifetime." Jake, who had been inching closer to the water's edge, suddenly called out, "Mom, Dad, look!" Following his pointed finger, they saw a young deer cautiously approaching the pool at the base of the falls. It dipped its head to drink, ears twitching. Alertly, the Millers watched in silent awe as the deer quenched its thirst, unaware of its human audience. After a few moments, it raised its head, water dripping from its muzzle, and bounded back into the forest. As it disappeared from view, Jake turned to his parents, his face glowing with excitement. "That was amazing! Can we come back tomorrow? Maybe we'll see more animals." James and Linda exchanged amused glances. "We'll see, buddy," James said. "We've still got a lot of park to explore." As they began their hike back to the campsite, the family felt a renewed sense of purpose and unity. The bear encounter, while terrifying, had shown them their own strength and resilience. They had faced one of nature's most formidable creatures and come out the other side not unscathed, but unbroken. The Great Smoky Mountains still held dangers, but now they also promised adventure, beauty, and the chance to grow, closer as a family. With each step on the sun-dappled trail, the Millers moved forward, ready to embrace whatever challenges and wonders the wilderness had in store for them. The pre-dawn light filtered through the dense canopy of the Great Smoky Mountains, casting long shadows across the Millers' campsite. Linda stirred first, the events of the past few days having made her a light sleeper. She unzipped the tent flap quietly, careful not to wake James and Jake, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. As she set about preparing coffee on their camp stove, Linda's mind wandered back to the bear encounter. The fear still lingered, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of resilience. They had faced the worst and survived. Now it was time to truly embrace their adventure. James emerged from the tent, stifling a yawn. "Morning," he mumbled, gratefully accepting the steaming mug Linda offered him. "How long have you been up?" "Not long," Linda replied, her eyes scanning the tree line out of habit. "I was thinking, maybe we should try that longer hike today. The one to Andrews Bald." James raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Are you sure it's pretty challenging?" Linda nodded, a determined glint in her eye. "I'm sure. We came here for an adventure, right? It's time we stopped letting fear hold us back." A slow smile spread across James's face. He leaned in and kissed his wife softly. "That's my girl. Andrews Bald it is." Their quiet moment was interrupted by Jake's excited voice from inside the tent. "Did someone say hike? Can we see more waterfalls?" As the family prepared for their most ambitious hike yet, there was a palpable energy in the air. They packed their backpacks with extra care, double-checking their supplies and going over the trail map together. "Remember," James said as they set out, "this is a long one. If anyone gets tired or wants to turn back, just say the word. No shame in knowing our limits." The trail to Andrews Bald started out deceptively easy, a gentle incline winding through a forest of towering hemlocks and Fraser firs. The morning mist clung to the undergrowth, giving the woods an ethereal quality. Jake, full of energy, bounded ahead on the trail. "Come on, slowpokes," he called back to his parents. "We've got a mountain to climb." Linda chuckled, adjusting her backpack straps. "Pace yourself, honey. We've got a long way to go." As they climbed higher, the trail became steeper and more challenging. The dense forest gradually gave way to more open terrain, offering breathtaking glimpses of the surrounding mountains through gaps in the trees. About 2 hours into their hike, they paused for a water break. Jake flopped dramatically onto a fallen log, wiping sweat from his brow. "How much further?" he panted. James consulted the map. "We're about halfway there, champ. How are you holding up?" Jake considered for a moment, then straightened up, a determined look on his face. "I'm good, let's keep going." As they continued their ascent, the family fell into a rhythm, their breathing synchronizing with their footsteps. The physical exertion and the beauty of their surroundings pushed thoughts of bears and danger to the back of their minds. Suddenly, Linda froze, holding up a hand to halt the others. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a clearing just off the trail. There, not 30 feet away, stood a magnificent elk, its antlers silhouetted against the sky. The animal regarded them calmly, chewing on some vegetation. "Wow," Jake breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's huge." James slowly reached for his camera, his movements deliberate and careful. He managed to snap a few photos before the elk, apparently deciding it had indulged the humans' curiosity long enough, ambled off into the forest. The encounter left them all buzzing with excitement. "Did you see those antlers?" Jake exclaimed, as they resumed their hike. "They were bigger than me." The final stretch to Andrews Bald was the most challenging yet. The trail became rocky and steep, requiring them to scramble in places. But with each difficult step, their determination grew. When they finally emerged onto Andrews Bald, the view took their breath away. The grassy meadow stretched out before them, dotted with wildflowers, while the surrounding mountains seemed to touch the sky. "We made it," Linda said softly, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. The pride in her voice was unmistakable. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We sure did. What do you think, Jake? Was it worth the climb?" But Jake was already off, running through the meadow with unbridled joy. His laughter carried on the wind, infectious in its purity. As they settled down for a well-earned picnic lunch, the Millers felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had pushed their limits, faced their fears, and been rewarded with a view few ever got to experience. "You know," James said between bites of his sandwich, "I think this trip has changed us." Linda nodded, her gaze distant. "It's funny. We came here looking for an escape, a break from our routine. Instead, we found, I don't know, strength maybe." "Definitely strength," James agreed. "And something else too. A kind of awareness of nature, of each other, of ourselves." Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, piped up. "I'm not scared of bears anymore," he declared. "Well, maybe a little. But I know we can handle it." His parents exchanged a proud look. "That's right. Buddy," James said, "we can handle anything as long as we stick together." As they began their descent back down the mountain, the family moved with a new confidence. The forest, which had once seemed full of hidden dangers, now felt more like a challenging but ultimately benevolent presence. About halfway down, they encountered another group of hikers heading up. The leader, a grizzled man in his 60s, nodded approvingly at Jake. "Making good time, young man. Not many kids your age make it up to Andrews Bald." Jake beamed with pride. "It was tough, but really cool. We saw an elk and everything." As they continued on, Linda reflected on how much Jake had grown over the course of their trip. The scared little boy who had hidden in the tent during the bear encounter seemed a distant memory. In his place was a more confident, resilient child, one who had discovered his own strength in the face of adversity. The sun was low in the sky by the time they made it back to their campsite, their legs aching, but their spirits soaring. As James set about starting a fire for dinner, Linda and Jake worked together to gather more firewood. "Mom," Jake said as they collected fallen branches, "can we come back here next year?" Linda paused, surprised by the question. After everything they'd been through, she had half expected Jake to never want to set foot in the woods again. "You really want to?" Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I want to try more trails and maybe see more animals. As long as they're not too close," he added with a grin. Linda felt a lump form in her throat. She knelt down and pulled Jake into a tight hug. "Of course we can come back, sweetie. I'm so proud of you, you know that?" As they sat around the campfire that evening, roasting marshmallows and recounting the day's adventures, the Millers felt a deep sense of contentment. The forest around them, once a source of fear, now felt like a second home. James raised his mug of hot chocolate in a toast. "To the great Smoky Mountains," he said. "May they always remind us of what we're capable of." "To family," Linda added, clinking her mug against his. "And facing our fears together." Jake thrust his mug into the middle, marshmallows smeared across his grin. "To adventure." As the stars came out, twinkling between the swaying treetops, The Millers settled into a comfortable silence. The crackling fire, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, it all combined into a soothing lullaby of the wild. They had come to these mountains seeking a vacation and found something far more valuable. They had discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed, a deeper appreciation for the natural world, and a stronger bond as a family. Tomorrow would bring new trails to explore, new challenges to face. But for now, surrounded by the ancient forests of the Smokies, the Millers were content. They had faced their fears, pushed their limits, and emerged stronger for it. Whatever adventures lay ahead, they would face them together, with the spirit of the mountains in their hearts. The morning sun had barely crested the ridgeline when the Millers emerged from their tent, groggy but excited for the day ahead. Their time in the Great Smoky Mountains was drawing to a close, and they were determined to make the most of their final full day. As James stoked the campfire for breakfast, Linda pored over the park map, tracing potential routes with her finger. "What do you think about chimney tops?" she asked, glancing up at her husband. "It's supposed to have amazing views." James nodded, pouring coffee into their battered enamel mugs. "Sounds good to me. Jake, you up for one last big hike?" Jake, who was carefully toasting a Pop-Tart over the fire, grinned. "You bet. Is it a hard one?" Linda chuckled. "It's pretty challenging, sweetie. Lots of steep climbs. But I think after Andrew's bald, we can handle it." As they ate breakfast, the family chatted excitedly about their plans for the day. The fear that had gripped them earlier in the week had transformed into a palpable sense of adventure. Even the usual sounds of the forest waking up, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant calls of birds, seemed more thrilling than ominous now. They were just finishing up when Ranger Sarah approached their campsite, her face etched with concern. "Good morning, Millers," she said, her tone serious. "I'm glad I caught you before you headed out. We've got a situation developing." James stood up, instantly alert. "What kind of situation?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "That problem bear we talked about, the one that visited your campsite? Well, he's been spotted again not far from here. We think he might be injured." Linda gasped, instinctively pulling Jake closer. "Injured? How?" "We're not sure," Sarah replied, "but he's acting erratically, approaching campsites even during the day. We're organizing search parties to try and locate him before he hurts himself or someone else." Jake looked up at the ranger, his eyes wide. "Are you going to have to—" He couldn't bring himself to say the word kill. Sarah knelt down to Jake's level. "That's absolutely the last thing we want to do, Jake. Our goal is to tranquilize him and get him the help he needs. But to do that, we need to find him first." James and Linda exchanged a look, years of shared understanding passing between them. James turned back to Sarah. "How can we help?" Sarah looked surprised. "You want to help? I appreciate the offer, but it could be dangerous. You've already had one close call with this bear." Linda stepped forward, her jaw set with determination. "Exactly, we've seen him up close. We might be able to identify him if we spot him. Plus," James added, "we know these trails pretty well now. We could cover more ground with more search." "Parties?" Sarah considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we could use the extra hands, but you'll need to follow orders exactly. And at the first sign of danger, you get yourselves to safety. Deal?" The Millers nodded solemnly. Jake tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Can I help too?" Sarah smiled down at him. "You sure can, buddy. In fact, you might be our secret weapon. Kids often notice things adults miss." As they quickly packed up their gear, the gravity of the situation settled over the family. This was no longer just a vacation adventure. They were embarking on a real-life rescue mission. Sarah briefed them as they hiked to the command post she'd set up near the ranger station. "The bear was last seen near the Chimney Tops Trail, ironically where you were planning to go anyway. We've closed the trail to the public, but we'll be sending teams up to search the area." At the command post, they were given bright orange vests and walkie-talkies. Sarah paired them with another ranger, a young man named Mike, and assigned them a section of the trail to search. As they set out, Mike explained the plan. "We'll move slowly and quietly. Look for any signs of the bear. Tracks, disturbed vegetation, fresh droppings. And remember, if you spot him, do not approach. Radio in immediately and wait for backup. The forest seemed different now, charged with a sense of urgency and purpose. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the bushes made them freeze, hearts pounding. Jake proved to be an excellent spotter, his keen eyes catching details the adults often missed. "Look," he whispered about an hour into their search, pointing to a fallen log. "Are those claw marks?" Mike crouched down to examine the wood. "Good eye, Jake. These are fresh too. We must be on the right track." As they pressed on, the trail became steeper and more challenging. The dense forest gave way to rocky outcroppings, offering breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. Under different circumstances, the Millers would have been awestruck by the scenery. Now their eyes scanned constantly for any sign of movement. It was James who spotted him first. "There!" he hissed, pointing to a small clearing about 50 yards ahead. The bear was lumbering slowly between the trees, its gait noticeably uneven. Mike immediately radioed in their position. "All units, this is Mike. We have a visual on the target, coordinates to follow. Do not approach, repeat, do not approach." Linda pulled Jake close, her arm protectively around his shoulders. They watched in tense silence as the bear moved through the clearing. Even from this distance, they could see that something was wrong. The animal's fur was matted in places, and it favored its left front paw. "What's wrong with him?" Jake whispered, his voice thick with concern. "I'm not sure, buddy," James replied softly, "but the rangers will help him." As if on cue, they heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching. The bear's head snapped up, its nostrils flaring. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked directly at the Miller's position. "Nobody move," Mike breathed, his hand hovering near the bear spray on his belt. The bear let out a low, mournful sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Then, with surprising speed for an injured animal, it turned and crashed off into the underbrush. "He's running," Jake cried. "We have to follow him." Mike held out an arm, stopping Jake from darting forward. "We stay put," he said firmly. "The helicopter team will track him now. Our job is to guide the ground team to this location." The next hour was a blur of activity. More rangers arrived, combing the area for clues about the bear's condition and direction. Sarah joined them, her face grim but determined. "We've got a visual from the air," she reported. "He's headed towards a ravine about a mile north of here. We're going to try to herd him into a clearing where we can tranquilize him safely." The Millers waited anxiously, straining their ears for any sound that might indicate success or failure. Jake paced back and forth, peppering Mike with questions about bear behavior and tranquilizer darts. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "Target is down, I repeat, target is down, veterinary team moving in." A collective sigh of relief went through the group. Mike clapped James on the shoulder. "You folks did good work today. Not many tourists would volunteer for something like this." As they made their way back down the trail, Sarah filled them in on the bear's condition. "Looks like he got into a fight with another bear, probably over territory. He's got some nasty cuts and a sprained paw, but the vet thinks he'll make a full recovery. We're going to relocate him to a more remote area of the park once he's healed up." Jake's face lit up. "So he's going to be okay?" Sarah nodded, smiling. "Thanks in large part to your family, Jake. Your sharp eyes helped us find him before things got worse." As they approached the campground, exhausted but exhilarated, Linda turned to James. "Some vacation, huh? I don't think this is quite what we had in mind when we planned a relaxing family trip to the mountains." James laughed, pulling her close. "No, but I wouldn't change a thing. Look at us. We came here afraid of our own shadows, and now we're helping rescue wildlife." Jake, overhearing, piped up. "Can we do this again next year? Maybe we can help with wolf tracking or something." His parents exchanged amused glances. "Let's get through this trip first, buddy," James chuckled. "But I have a feeling our camping trips are going to be a lot more interesting from now on." As they settled in around their campfire that evening, the Millers felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had come to the Great Smoky Mountains seeking adventure, and they had found it in spades. More than that, they had discovered reserves of courage and resilience they never knew they possessed. Linda raised her mug of hot chocolate. "To the Millers," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The family that faces bears together stays together." "To the Millers," James and Jake echoed, clinking their mugs together. As the stars came out twinkling between the swaying treetops, the family sat in comfortable silence. The forest around them, once a source of fear, now felt like a second home. They had entered these woods as tourists and were leaving as something more, stewards, in their own small way, of this wild and beautiful place. Tomorrow would bring the long drive home, back to the familiar routines of their everyday lives. But something had changed irrevocably. The spirit of the mountains, the thrill of adventure, and the newfound confidence in their ability to face challenges together, these things they would carry with them always. As Jake drifted off to sleep that night, his dreams were filled, not with frightening bears but with soaring vistas, rushing waterfalls, and the quiet strength of ancient forests. And in those dreams, the Millers walked the mountain trails together, unafraid and unstoppable, ready for whatever adventure awaited around the next bend. The morning sun crept over the mountains, casting long shadows across the Millers' campsite. It was their last day in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and a bittersweet mood hung in the air as they began to pack up their gear. Jake emerged from the tent, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Do we really have to go home today?" he asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. Linda ruffled his hair affectionately. "Afraid so, sweetie. But hey, we've still got time for one last little adventure before we hit the road. What do you say we check out that short trail to Cataract Falls?" Jake's face lit up. "Yeah, can we, Dad?" James nodded, zipping up a duffel bag. "Sounds perfect. A nice easy hike to wrap things up." As they finished packing the car, leaving out only what they'd need for their short hike, Ranger Sarah approached their campsite. "Morning, Millers, heading out today?" she asked, a friendly smile on her face. "Unfortunately, yes," James replied. "But we're squeezing in one last hike to Cataract Falls before we go." Sarah's expression turned serious. "Actually, I'm glad I caught you. We've had some reports of unusual bear activity near that trail this morning." The Millers exchanged glances, a mix of concern and excitement passing between them. Is it the same bear?" Jake asked hesitantly. Sarah shook her head. "No, the bear you helped us with is safely relocated. This is likely a different one, probably drawn by some improperly stored food from other campers. We're not closing the trail, but we are advising extra caution." Linda bit her lip, looking at James. "Maybe we should skip it. Play it safe." James was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he turned to Jake. "What do you think, buddy? This is your adventure too. Do you still want to go?" Jake stood a little straighter, his chin lifting with determination. "I think we should go. We know what to do now, right? Make noise, stay together, and if we see a bear, we back away slowly." Pride swelled in James's chest. He nodded approvingly. "That's right. Sarah, what do you think? Is it safe enough if we take precautions?" Sarah smiled. "You folks have shown you can handle yourselves. Just stay alert, make plenty of noise, and stick together. And take this, just in case." She handed James an air horn. "It'll scare off most wildlife if you need it." With renewed excitement, the Millers set off down the trail to Cataract Falls. The forest seemed different now, not the ominous unknown entity it had been when they first arrived, but a living, breathing ecosystem that they had come to understand and respect. As they walked, they reminisced about their week in the park. "Remember when we first got here?" Linda laughed. "We were jumping at every sound," James grinned. "And now look at us, seasoned wilderness experts." "Well, I wouldn't go that far," Linda replied, but her voice was warm with pride. Jake, walking between them, piped up. "My favorite part was helping find that injured bear. Do you think he's okay now?" "I'm sure he is, thanks to you," James assured him. "You might have a future as a park ranger, you know." As they rounded a bend in the trail, the sound of rushing water reached their ears. The path opened up, revealing Cataract Falls in all its glory. Water cascaded down a series of rocky steps, creating a misty veil that sparkled in the morning sunlight. "Wow," Jake breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. They stood for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. Then, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught James's eye. His body tensed instinctively. "Don't make any sudden moves," he said quietly, "but we're not alone." Linda and Jake followed his gaze. There, partially hidden by a thicket of rhododendrons, was a black bear. It was smaller than the one that had attacked their campsite, probably younger, but still an imposing sight. Jake's hand found Linda's, squeezing tight. but his voice was steady when he spoke. "What do we do, Dad?" James slowly reached for the air horn Sarah had given him. "We back away, nice and slow. I'll use this if I need to, but let's try not to startle it." They began to retreat, their movements careful and deliberate. The bear, which had been snuffling at something on the ground, raised its head, finally noticing them. Linda's breath caught in her throat. "James," she whispered, a note of panic in her voice. "It's okay," James murmured. "We're okay. Just keep moving." The bear took a step towards them, its nose twitching as it caught their scent. Jake, remembering the ranger's lessons, began to speak in a calm, firm voice. "Hey, bear. We see you. We're just going to go now. This is your place, not ours." To everyone's surprise, the bear paused. It tilted its head almost as if it were listening to Jake's words. Encouraged, Jake continued, "We don't want to bother you. We're leaving you alone now." Slowly, incredibly, the bear turned away. It ambled back towards the rhododendrons, disappearing into the foliage as if it had never been there at all. For a moment, the Millers stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Then, as one, they let out a collective sigh of relief. "Oh my God," Linda gasped, pulling Jake into a tight hug. "Jake, you were amazing." James ruffled Jake's hair, his hand trembling slightly. "That's my boy, cool as a cucumber." Jake beamed, but his voice shook a little as he asked, "Can we go back to the car now?" They made their way back down the trail, their senses on high alert. But the forest remained peaceful, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the distant rush of the waterfall. As they reached the parking lot, they saw Ranger Sarah waiting by their car, a concerned look on her face. "Everything okay?" she called out as they approached. "We got a report of a bear sighting on the trail." James nodded, still a little breathless from the encounter. "We saw it, near the falls, but we're all fine." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "You saw it, and you're this calm? What happened?" As they recounted the experience, Sarah's expression changed from concern to admiration. "Well, I'll be," she said when they finished. "Sounds like you handled that perfectly, especially you, Jake. Not many kids your age would keep their cool like that." Jake blushed, scuffing his shoe on the gravel. "I just remembered what you taught." "Us?" Sarah smiled warmly. "Well, you learned those lessons well. You know, we have a junior ranger program. After everything you've done this week, I'd say you've more than earned a badge. What do you think?" Jake's eyes lit up. "Really? Can I, Mom? Dad?" James and Linda exchanged glances, then nodded. "I think you've definitely earned it," Linda said. As Sarah pinned the junior ranger badge to Jake's shirt, the Millers felt a sense of completion. What had started as a terrifying encounter had led them on a journey of growth, courage, and connection, both with nature and with each other. With their car packed and Jake proudly wearing his new badge, the Millers prepared to leave the park. But as James turned the key in the ignition, Linda put a hand on his arm. "Wait," she said softly. "Let's just take a moment." They sat in silence, gazing out at the mountains that had been their home for the past week. The forests that had once seemed foreboding now felt like an old friend. "We'll come back," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "This place, it's part of us now." Linda nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "It sure is." From the back seat, Jake's voice piped up. "Next time, can we stay for 2 weeks?" James and Linda burst out laughing, the tension of the morning's encounter finally breaking. "We'll see, buddy," James chuckled. "We'll see." As they drove away, the great Smoky Mountains receded in their rearview mirror. But the lessons they had learned about nature, about themselves, about facing fears and overcoming challenges, those would stay with them always. The Millers were heading home, but they were not the same family that had arrived a week ago. They were stronger, now more confident, more connected, and somewhere in the vast wilderness behind them, a young bear ambled through the underbrush, unaware of the profound impact it had had on 3 human lives. The adventure was over, but its echoes would resonate in their hearts for years to come. And in Jake's dreams that night, as the car hummed along the highway towards home, he saw himself standing tall in a ranger uniform, ready to help the next family discover the wonders and face the challenges of the great outdoors, the Fuhr. Miller family's minivan rolled into their suburban driveway, the Great Smoky Mountains now hundreds of miles behind them. As James cut the engine, a heavy silence fell over the vehicle. For a moment, no one moved, each lost in their own thoughts about the incredible week they'd just experienced. Jake was the first to break the spell. "We're really home?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. Linda turned in her seat, offering a tired smile. "We sure are, sweetie. It feels strange, doesn't it?" James nodded, his eyes still fixed on the steering wheel. "Like we've been gone for a year, not just a week." As they began unloading the car, their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, bustled over, her curiosity palpable. "Welcome back," she called out. "How was the camping trip? Did you see any bears?" The Millers exchanged knowing glances, a wealth of unspoken experiences passing between them. "We sure did, Mrs. Thompson," Jake piped up, his chest puffing out with pride. "And I got a junior ranger badge?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "My goodness, you'll have to tell me all about it." James chuckled, ruffling Jake's hair. "Maybe later, Mrs. Thompson. We've got a lot of unpacking to do." As they carried their gear into the house, the familiar surroundings felt oddly foreign. The soft carpet under their feet, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint smell of the lemon-scented cleaner Linda had used before they left. It all seemed so tame. Linda sank onto the living room couch, exhaling deeply. "I can't believe how much happened in just 1 week." James nodded, setting down an armload of sleeping bags. "It's like we lived a lifetime out there." Jake bounded into the room, still full of energy despite the long drive. "Can we put up this tent in the backyard, please? I don't want to sleep inside yet." His parents exchanged amused glances. "How about we unpack first, champ?" James suggested. "Then maybe we can think about a backyard campout this weekend." As they sorted through their gear, the memories came flooding back. Linda held up Jake's torn t-shirt from their first night, the fabric still bearing the marks of their panicked flight from the bear. "I should throw this out," she mused. "No," Jake protested. "I want to keep it, to remember." James nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we should frame it, our first family battle scar." They laughed, but there was a note of seriousness in it. They had faced real danger after all. The weight of that realization settled over them as they continued unpacking. Later that evening, as Linda prepared dinner, their first home-cooked meal in a week, Jake sat at the kitchen table, regaling his parents with a blow-by-blow account of their adventures. "And then when we saw that bear at the waterfall, I remembered everything Ranger Sarah taught us," he said, his eyes shining. "I wasn't even scared." Linda paused in her cooking, turning to face her son. "You were very brave, Jake, but it's okay if you were scared too. We all were." Jake's enthusiasm dimmed a little. "Yeah, I guess I was a little scared, but that's normal, right? Even for grown-ups." James, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the kitchen. "Absolutely, buddy. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what needs to be done even when you are scared." Jake nodded, processing this. Do you think the bears get scared too, when they see us?" The question caught James off guard. He sat down at the table, considering his answer carefully. "You know, I bet they do. They're probably just as wary of us as we are of them, maybe even more so since we're in their home." This new perspective seemed to fascinate Jake. "So when we were backing away and I was talking to the bear, maybe I was helping it not be scared too." Linda joined them at the table, dinner preparations momentarily forgotten. "That's a really thoughtful way to look at it, Jake. I think you're right. By staying calm and showing the bear we didn't want to hurt it, you were helping both us and the bear." As they sat down to dinner, the conversation continued to revolve around their camping trip. They laughed about James's failed attempts at fire starting on the first night, marveled at the breathtaking view from Andrew's Bald, and relived the heart-pounding excitement of helping the Rangers track the injured bear. "You know," Linda said, between bites, "I keep thinking about how close we came to turning back after that first night. Can you imagine if we'd left?" James shook his head. "We would have missed out on so much. Not just the beautiful hikes and views, but—" "The chance to be heroes," Jake interjected. His parents chuckled. "Well, I don't know about heroes," James said, "but we definitely would have missed the chance to discover how strong we can be when we work together." After dinner, as they settled, In front of the TV for their usual evening routine, something felt off. The flashing images and canned laughter seemed hollow compared to the rich, real experiences they'd had over the past week. Jake was the first to voice what they were all feeling. "Can we turn this off? Maybe we could, I don't know, play a game or something." Linda smiled, reaching for the remote. "That's a great idea, honey. How about we look at the photos from our trip instead?" They spent the next hour huddled around James's laptop, reliving their adventure through the pictures he'd taken. There were shots of breathtaking vistas, of Jake proudly holding up a fish he'd caught, of Linda laughing as she tried to set up the tent, and of course the prized photo of the elk they'd encountered on the trail to Andrews Bald. As they scrolled through the images, Jake grew quieter, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What's on your mind, buddy?" James asked, noticing his son's change in demeanor. Jake was silent for a moment before responding. "I was just thinking about how different everything looks here. In the pictures, I mean. It's beautiful, but it doesn't really show how it felt to be there." Linda nodded, understanding. "That's true. Photos can capture what we see, but they can't really show what we experienced. Like how the air smelled after it rained," Jake continued, warming to his theme, "or how quiet it was at night, except for all the little noises that seemed really loud." James smiled, impressed by his son's insight. "You're absolutely right, Jake. There's so much about being in nature that you can only understand by experiencing it." As bedtime approached, Jake grew uncharacteristically clingy. "Do I have to sleep in my room?" he asked. "Can't we all sleep in the living room like we did in the tent?" Linda and James exchanged glances. They both understood Jake's reluctance to be alone after a week of such close family bonding. "Tell you what," James said, "how about we have a family sleepover in the living room tonight? We can drag out the sleeping bags and everything." Jake's face lit up. "Really? Awesome!" As they settled into their makeshift camp in the living room, the soft glow of a nightlight replacing their campfire, Linda felt a surge of emotion. "No," she said softly. "I think this trip changed us." James nodded, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "For the better, I'd say." Jake, snuggled between them in his sleeping bag, yawned widely. "Can we go back next year?" he mumbled, already half asleep. "Definitely," James replied. "But for now, let's get some rest. We've got a lot of stories to share with everyone tomorrow." As the Millers drifted off to sleep, the sounds of their quiet suburban neighborhood replacing the wild symphony of the forest, they each carried with them a piece of the wilderness they'd left behind. The great Smoky Mountains had challenged them, scared them, and ultimately transformed them. They had entered the forest as tourists and emerged as a stronger, more connected family, with a newfound respect for the wild and for each other. In the morning, they would return to their normal lives, work, school, and the daily routines of suburban existence. But something fundamental had shifted. The spirit of adventure that had awakened in them would not be easily forgotten. And somewhere in the Great Smoky Mountains, the bears they'd encountered continued their ancient routines, unaware of the profound impact they'd had on 3 human lives. The Millers' camping trip was over, but their journey, as a family and as stewards of the natural world, was just beginning. Sarah Johnson's legs burned as she pushed herself up the steep mountain trail. The crisp Montana air filled her lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and wildflowers. It was her 3rd day hiking alone in Glacier National Park, and the solitude had been exactly what she needed to clear her head after a stressful year at work. As she rounded a bend in the trail, a movement in her peripheral vision made her pause. There, not 20 yards away, stood a massive grizzly bear. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as her mind raced through everything she knew about bear encounters. "Stay calm, don't run. Make yourself look big." With trembling hands, she slowly reached for the bear spray on her belt. The bear, which had been lazily pawing at a berry bush, suddenly noticed her presence. It raised its head, nostrils flaring, as it caught her scent. "Hey, bear," Sarah called out, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound confident. "I see you there. I'm just going to back away slowly." The bear dropped to all fours, and for a moment, Sarah dared to hope it would simply amble off into the woods. But then it charged. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Sarah fumbled with the bear spray, her fingers clumsy with fear. By the time she managed to release the safety catch, the bear was upon her. She squeezed the trigger, but in her panic, the spray went wide, missing the bear entirely. Pain exploded through her body as the bear's massive paw struck her, sending her tumbling down the rocky slope. She came to a stop against a fallen log, dazed and gasping for air. The bear loomed over her, its hot breath on her face. "Please," Sarah whimpered, squeezing her eyes shut. "Please don't kill me." The bear's jaws clamped down on her left arm, and Sarah screamed. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced. In that moment, she was certain she was going to die. But then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the bear released her. It reared up on its hind legs, letting out a deafening roar before crashing off into the underbrush. Sarah lay there, her body racked with pain, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The attack had lasted only moments, but it had felt like an eternity. With agonizing slowness, she pulled herself into a sitting position, cradling her mangled arm against her chest. Blood seeped through her shredded jacket, and she could see white bone protruding from her forearm. "Help!" she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somebody help me." But Sarah knew the chances of anyone hearing her were slim. She was miles from the nearest campground, on a trail she had chosen specifically for its lack of other hikers. If she was going to survive, she would have to save herself. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah staggered to her feet. Every movement sent waves of agony through her body, but she forced herself to take one step, then another. "You can do this," she muttered to herself. "One foot in front of the other. Just keep moving." As she limped down the trail, leaving a trail of blood in her wake, Sarah's mind raced. How far was she from help? Would the bear come back to finish what it had started? And most pressingly, how long could she keep going before the blood loss and shock overwhelmed her? Hours passed, in a haze of pain and determination. Sarah's progress was agonizingly slow, each step a monumental effort. She stopped frequently to rest, fighting against the overwhelming urge to close her eyes and give in to exhaustion. "Stay awake," she told herself sternly. "If you fall asleep now, you'll never wake up." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the trail, Sarah's hope began to falter. She had been walking for what felt like an eternity, but she seemed no closer to salvation. Her injured arm had gone worryingly numb, and her vision was starting to blur around the edges. Just as she was about to collapse, convinced that she could go no further, she heard it, the distant sound of voices. At first, she thought she must be hallucinating, but no, there it was again, human voices coming closer. "Help!" she screamed, or tried to. What came out was a hoarse whisper, barely audible even to her own ears. But somehow, miraculously, they heard her. Two hikers, a young couple out for an evening stroll, came into view around the bend. Their expressions of carefree enjoyment quickly turned to horror as they took in Sarah's battered form. "Oh my God," the woman gasped. "What happened to you?" "Bear," Sarah managed to croak before her legs finally gave out. The next few hours passed in a blur. Sarah had vague memories of being carried on a makeshift stretcher, of a helicopter landing in a clearing, of concerned faces peering down at her as she drifted in and out of consciousness. When she finally came to full awareness, she was in a hospital bed, her left arm encased in a cast and suspended above her. A nurse was adjusting her IV, and Sarah could see her parents asleep in chairs by the window. "Welcome back," the nurse said softly, noticing Sarah's open eyes. "You gave everyone quite a scare." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The nurse offered her a sip of water through a straw. "The bear," Sarah rasped after she had drunk. "Did they find it?" The nurse shook her head. "Park rangers are still searching the area, but no sign of it yet. You're incredibly lucky, you know. Not many people survive a grizzly attack like that." Lucky. The word echoed in Sarah's mind. She didn't feel lucky. She felt broken, terrified, and overwhelmed by the knowledge of how close she had come to death. Over the next few weeks, as Sarah began the long process of physical recovery, she also grappled with the psychological aftermath of her ordeal. Nightmares plagued her sleep, vivid recreations of the attack that left her gasping and drenched in sweat. "I can still feel its breath on my face," she told her therapist during one particularly difficult session. "I can smell its fur, hear the sound of its teeth tearing into my arm." How do I make it stop? The road to recovery was long and arduous. Multiple surgeries were required to repair the damage to Sarah's arm, and months of physical therapy followed. But slowly, painfully, she began to heal. As her physical wounds mended, Sarah found herself drawn back to the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. At first, the very thought of returning to the trails filled her with paralyzing fear. But with the support of her therapist and a group for survivors of animal attacks, she began to take small steps. "I refuse to let fear control my life," she declared, standing at the trailhead of a small nature preserve near her home. "That bear took enough from me. It doesn't get to take this too." 6 months after the attack, Sarah returned to Glacier National Park. She stood at the visitor center, staring up at the majestic peaks that had once filled her with awe, and now inspired a complex mixture of fear and determination. "I'm not here to conquer the mountain," she told a park ranger who recognized her. "From the news stories, I'm here to make peace with it and with myself." As she set off down the trail, bear spray within easy reach and a whistle around her neck, Sarah felt a sense of empowerment wash over her. She was not the same person who had naively ventured into these woods alone all those months ago. She was stronger now, more aware, more respectful of the wild and its inherent dangers. "Hello, bear," she called out as she hiked, her voice strong and clear. "I know you're out there, and I respect your home. Let's coexist peacefully today." With each step, Sarah reclaimed a piece of herself that the attack had taken. She would never forget the terror of that day, the pain, the struggle for survival. But neither would she let it define her. She was a survivor, a woman who had looked death in the face and emerged stronger for it. As the sun began to set on her hike, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Sarah paused to take in the view. The beauty of the wilderness stretched out before her, wild and untamed and gloriously alive. And for the first time since the attack, Sarah felt truly at peace. "Thank you," she whispered to the mountains, the trees, even to the unseen bears that roamed these forests. "Thank you for this second chance." With a deep breath and a smile, Sarah turned and began the journey back down the trail, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, both on the mountain and in life.